Hello there and welcome to Just About Earth, where curiosity gets cozy, ancient stones get a little less silent, and science takes the long, quiet path into the places history has not fully explained. Tonight, we are travelling to eastern India, to the granite hills of Bihar, where the landscape holds a set of caves that do not look quite like the rough shelters we might expect from the ancient world. These are not soft limestone caverns slowly shaped by dripping water. They are not wide, natural chambers decorated by time and minerals. They are rooms cut directly into hard granite, carved more than 2,300 years ago, and finished with a polish so smooth that light can glide across the walls like it has found a still pond underground. The surfaces shine, the chambers echo, the doors open into darkness with a kind of plain, unsettling precision. And once you learn how old they are, it becomes very difficult not to pause and ask, quite reasonably, who exactly looked at a granite hill and thought, yes, let us make that into a perfectly finished room. These are the Barabar Caves, among the oldest surviving rock-cut caves in India, created during the Mauryan period, when Emperor Ashoka ruled over one of the largest empires the Indian subcontinent had ever seen. But this is not only a story about a king, or monks, or archaeology, or one very determined group of stoneworkers having what must have been a rather intense work schedule. It is also a story about patient, sound, polished stone, lost beliefs, and the strange feeling that comes when human skill reaches such a level that it begins to look almost out of place. Not impossible, not supernatural, just unusually exact. The sort of exactness that makes your modern brain, surrounded by power tools, laser levels and electric sanding machines, quietly sit up and say, hang on a minute. Before we wander inside these dark and shining rooms, I would love to know where in the world you're listening from tonight. Are you somewhere quiet with the lights low and the day finally slowing down? Are you watching from a city apartment, a warm bed, a late train, or a corner of the world where morning has already arrived and the birds are starting to make their first unreasonable announcements? And if you could step into one ancient place anywhere on Earth, just for a few minutes, where would you go? Would it be a pyramid corridor, a Roman road, a temple buried in jungle, or perhaps one of these polished granite chambers in Bihar, or even a whisper can come back to you sounding larger than it should? If you find this little journey soothing, curious, or just a pleasant way to let the mind settle at the end of the day, I would be ever so grateful if you gave the video a like and subscribed. It helps this quiet corner of the internet reach other people who enjoy their mysteries served gently, with a blanket, a cup of tea, and only a moderate chance of becoming unexpectedly fascinated at bedtime. And I do hope this story does not keep you too alert. But if it does, well, at least you will have spent the evening in the company of ancient granite, vanished philosophers, and the kind of craftsmanship that makes even a very confident historian clear their throat before answering. So settle in. Let your shoulders loosen a little. Let the noise of the day move farther away. We're going to the Barabar Hills, a place that does not announce itself with the size of a pyramid or the height of a cathedral, but with something quieter and in some ways stranger. A place where the mystery is not that ancient people made caves, because of course they did. People have always looked for shelter, silence, ritual space and shade from the weather. The mystery is that they made these caves out of granite with such control, and then polished them to such a finish that the rooms feel less like caves and more like objects, as if the inside of the hill had been treated like a sculpture. The Barabar Hills lie in Bihar, not far from Gaya, in a region layered with religious and historical memory. This part of India is associated with some of the most important spiritual movements of the ancient world. Buddhism, Jainism, and other ascetic traditions all move through this wider landscape, arguing, meditating, teaching, wandering, debating, and occasionally making life rather difficult for anyone trying to keep a tidy list of who believed what and when. The world of the 3rd century BCE was not a simple place. It was crowded with ideas. Some people renounced possessions, Some rejected ritual sacrifice. Some sought liberation from rebirth. Some believed in strict destiny. Some questioned authority. Some sat in forests, caves, and monasteries trying to understand suffering, the self, and the nature of existence, which is more or less what many people now attempt to do while staring into the fridge at midnight. In the middle of that world stood Ashoka, the Mauryan emperor whose name still echoes through Indian history. He's famous for his inscriptions, his edicts, and his support of moral and religious life after the violence of conquest. Across his empire, messages were carved into stone pillars and rock faces, meant to be read, remembered, and obeyed. Stone was not just material, it was communication, it was authority made visible. It was a message to the future, although perhaps not even Ashoka could have guessed that people more than 2 millennia later would be zooming in on photographs of his caves and arguing online about Polish marks. The Barabar Caves are usually connected with Ashoka and with the Ajivikas, a now vanished religious sect that once stood alongside Buddhists and Jains as one of the major ascetic traditions of ancient India. The Ajivikas are difficult to understand today because their own writings have not survived in the way Buddhist and Jain texts have. Much of what we know about them comes from their rivals, which is always a little awkward. It is rather like trying to understand your personality based only on comments left by people who disagreed with you at a dinner party. Still, the Ajivikas seem to have held a strong belief in fate or cosmic determinism, the idea that life unfolds according to a fixed principle beyond ordinary human control. They lived as ascetics. They renounced comforts. They wandered, meditated, and sought a kind of discipline that was probably not improved by access to polished granite rooms, but certainly made more memorable by them. And that is one of the first puzzles of Barabar. These caves were not palaces. They were not tombs full of treasure. They were not built as royal pleasure chambers, unless ancient royal pleasure involved sitting in total darkness, while your own cough returned from the walls with alarming enthusiasm. The inscriptions tell us that at least some of these spaces were dedicated to the Ajivikas. That gives us a purpose on paper, but it does not fully explain the effort. Why create such carefully finished spaces for ascetics, people who are not supposed to be attached to luxury? Why polish the walls until they gleamed? Why shape the rooms in ways that produced extraordinary acoustics? Why cut into one of the hardest stones available when softer rock would have been far easier, less exhausting, and much kinder to the wrists? To appreciate the strangeness of the caves, we need to slow down and imagine what granite actually is. Granite is not a friendly material. It is hard, dense, and stubborn. It does not politely yield to casual scraping. It is made from interlocking crystals of minerals like quartz and feldspar, and those minerals are tough. Even today, cutting and polishing granite is heavy work. We use diamond tools, powered saws, abrasives, water cooling drills, grinders, and machinery that makes a noise as if several angry cupboards are being dragged across the floor at once. Ancient builders did not have those tools. They had knowledge, time, labour, experience, and materials that archaeologists still debate in detail. They had iron tools in the Mauryan period, and they may have used hammering, chiselling, pecking, grinding, and polishing with abrasives. But even when we say that, the words can feel too neat. They make the process sound like a recipe. Take one granite hill, add some chisels, sprinkle with patience, polish until mirror-like, serve after 2,300 years with a side of unanswered questions. The reality must have been slow, noisy, and physically demanding. Imagine standing before a granite outcrop beneath the hot Bihar sky, not with a modern drill, not with a construction crew wearing hard hats and checking messages, but with ancient tools, muscle, planning, and the authority of an empire behind the work. The stone would not care about ambition. It would not care about religion. It would resist every blow. To remove a chamber from within it would mean taking away stone bit by bit, shaping not an outside surface, but an interior void. A room is made not only by what remains, but by what is removed. Every mistake becomes difficult. Every curve requires judgment. Every wall must be brought into alignment through effort and touch. And then, after all that, after the chamber had been hollowed, shaped and smoothed, someone decided it was not enough for the walls to be merely flat. They had to be polished, not a rough smoothing, not the practical finish of a cave made just good enough for shelter. The inner surfaces of some Barabar chambers have what is often called Mauryan polish, a finish seen also on famous stone pillars and sculptures from the Mauryan world. It gives the granite a reflective quality, dark and glossy, like stone that has been made almost liquid. The effect is startling because it changes what a cave is. A normal cave absorbs light. It swallows edges. It hides the marks of its own formation. These caves reflect. They answer. A lamp flame inside them does not simply illuminate the walls. It moves across them. There is something almost modern about that finish, and that is where the imagination begins to misbehave. People see the photographs, the smooth walls, the geometric chambers, the Arch of Lomas Rishi, and they reach for dramatic explanations. Some say the caves are too perfect to be ancient. Some say the polish looks impossible. Some suggest lost technologies, forgotten machines, or knowledge that later disappeared. And while it is sensible to be cautious with claims that race too quickly past evidence, it is also fair to admit why the caves provoke that reaction. They do not look like the stereotype many people carry of ancient construction. They do not look crude. They do not look tentative. They look controlled. That, perhaps, is the heart of tonight's mystery, not whether human beings could make them. Human beings clearly made extraordinary things all over the ancient world. They built with stone, wood, mud brick, bronze, iron, rope, geometry, astronomy, and endurance. They moved blocks, carved statues, raised pillars, aligned temples, and left behind monuments that still make our tidy modern assumptions look a little underdressed. The better question is how this particular skill developed, how it was organised, how the work was carried out in such hard stone, and why the result was made so unusually smooth. The Barabar Caves do not require us to dismiss ancient humans. They ask us to take them more seriously. The phrase "too perfect to be human-made" is useful as a feeling, not as a conclusion. It describes that first reaction when you see something ancient, and your sense of technological order briefly trips over its own shoes. We're used to thinking of history as a staircase, with every older age placed neatly below the present. The farther back we go, the rougher we expect things to become. Then a site like Barabar appears, and the staircase gets awkward. The caves remind us that ancient craftsmanship did not always move in a straight line from simple to complex. Skills can appear, flourish, specialise, and then fade. Techniques can belong to particular workshops, political systems, or religious needs. A craft can become astonishingly refined in one period and then become rare later, not because people became less intelligent, but because the conditions that supported it changed. At Barabar, those conditions may have included imperial power. Ashoka's empire had resources. It had administrators, roads, labour organisation, and the ability to support large projects. A ruler who could order inscriptions across a vast territory could also commission work in stone, yet even imperial power does not polish granite by itself. Somewhere between the king's command and the finished chamber were workers whose names we do not know. Stonecutters, polishers, planners, overseers, perhaps specialists who understood how to work with hard rock and how to achieve that glossy surface. Their skill is present everywhere in the caves, but they themselves have almost vanished. History often keeps the name of the ruler and loses the hands that did the work, which is rather unfair, especially if the hands spent months or years convincing granite to behave. Now picture approaching one of these caves. The outside is not necessarily overwhelming at first. This is not a monument designed to dominate a skyline. There are rounded granite hills, rocky surfaces, steps, openings, and in the case of Lomas Rishi, a famous carved facade that imitates older wooden architecture. That facade is important because it shows how stone architecture in India may have preserved shapes first developed in perishable materials. Wood rots, thatch disappears, bamboo and timber leave fewer traces, but stone remembers. So when ancient builders carved a curved doorway and decorative forms into the granite, they may have been translating an older building tradition into something that would last. It is a little like saving a voice recording of a song that was once only sung live. The material changes, but the shape carries memory. Lomas Rishi is often the cave that captures attention first because of its entrance. The carved arch, the flowing line, the figures, and the sense of a doorway leading inward all make it visually striking. But the interiors of the Barabar Caves are where the deeper unease begins. Inside, the spaces become simpler, darker, and stranger. There is no crowd of carved decoration covering every wall, no painted ceiling full of scenes, no busy reliefs to tell you exactly what to think. Instead, there are smooth plains of polished granite, carefully formed chambers, barrel-vaulted ceilings, and rounded spaces where sound behaves in a way that is hard to ignore. The restraint is part of the power. It does not distract you. It puts you in direct contact with stone, darkness, and your own presence. And then there is the echo. The Barabar chambers are known for strong acoustic effects. A voice inside can return with force. A chant may linger. A small sound can become larger, stretched and shaped by the stone. If you have ever spoken in a tunnel, a church, an empty stairwell, or a tiled bathroom, and suddenly felt your voice develop far more confidence than usual, you already know that architecture can change sound. At Barabar, this effect would have mattered. These were spaces for ascetics, and sound in such a chamber would not be a minor detail. A prayer, a chant, a syllable, even breathing might have seemed altered. The cave could answer the person inside it. It could make the invisible movement of sound feel physical. We should be careful not to invent certainty where the evidence is thin. We cannot simply say the caves were designed as acoustic instruments in the full modern sense. We do not have a manual from the builders saying, "Please stand here and hum for best results." But it is difficult to imagine that people using the caves did not notice the sound. Ancient people were not less observant than us. If anything, without constant electronic noise, they may have been more sensitive to small changes in echo, light, air, and surface. A polished granite chamber in darkness would have been an intense environment. The eye would find little to hold. The ear would become important. The body would feel the coolness of the stone. The mind, especially a mind trained in ascetic discipline, might meet itself there in a very direct way. This is why the Barabar Caves are not only a technological puzzle, they are also a human one. A purely mechanical explanation would tell us how stone was removed and polished. That would be useful and frankly very satisfying. But it would not answer why the space feels the way it does. It would not explain why a religious sect devoted to discipline and renunciation received chambers that were so exact, so polished, and so acoustically alive. It would not tell us what it was like to sit inside one when the lamp was low, the outside heat had faded, and the sound of a single voice returned from the granite walls. There is a temptation with ancient mysteries to rush toward the most dramatic answer, but the slower answer is often more interesting. The Barabar Caves do not need to be explained by impossible technology to be remarkable. Their existence is already remarkable within the known world of Mauryan stonework. They show that ancient Indian builders were capable of extraordinary control over hard material. They show that royal patronage could produce religious spaces unlike almost anything else from that time. They show that a vanished sect, now mostly known through fragments and hostile accounts, once mattered enough to receive some of the most carefully finished interiors of the ancient world. And they show that a cave can be more than a hollow in rock. It can be a designed experience. So tonight we will move carefully. Not as treasure hunters, not as people trying to force the stones into a theory before they have had a chance to speak. More like quiet visitors arriving at the edge of a granite hill and noticing the details one by one. The age, the hardness of the rock, the polish, the inscriptions, the missing explanations, the religious world that produced them, the sound that fills them. The strange survival of a place that feels both simple and almost too refined. Along the way, we will meet Ashoka and the Ajivikas. We will look at the caves themselves. We will think about tools and techniques, and we will ask why these chambers were made so dark, so smooth, and so resonant. And for now, it is enough to stand outside the entrance in the mind's eye. The stone is old, but not dead. The doorway is quiet, but not empty. Beyond it, the chamber waits with polished walls that have outlasted empires, arguments, weather, and memory. Somewhere inside that hard granite is a room made by people whose names are gone, for a faith that almost disappeared under a king whose inscriptions still speak. And before we go deeper into the hill, it is worth remembering that the greatest mysteries are not always the ones that deny human ability. Sometimes they are the ones that reveal just how much human ability we have forgotten how to imagine. To reach the Barabar Hills in the imagination, it helps not to begin with the caves themselves, but with the land around them. Because before there is any doorway, before there is any polished wall, before a voice enters the stone and comes back sounding larger than expected, there is Bahab, broad, ancient, lived in, sunlit, dusty, fertile, and full of histories that do not always announce themselves with signs and ticket counters. This is not a place where the past sits politely behind glass. It is worked into roads, fields, hills, shrines, railway lines, village paths, and the ordinary movement of people going about their day. Someone may be carrying water, someone may be guiding goats, someone may be selling tea beside the road. And not very far away, cut into granite that has been sitting there since long before any empire rose, are some of the strangest rooms ever made in ancient India. The Barabar Hills are not the sort of mountains that make a dramatic first impression from miles away. They are not Himalayan giants standing under snow, making every visitor feel immediately underdressed. They are lower, rounded, rocky hills rising from the surrounding land with a quieter confidence. Granite outcrops break through the surface, their forms smoothed by long exposure, heat, rain, and time. The stone appears heavy in a way that is hard to explain until you imagine trying to move even a small piece of it. It is not soft stone. It is not the kind of rock that invites a casual carving session after lunch. It is dense, tough, and resistant, the geological equivalent of someone who has already made up their mind. Around these hills, the landscape has changed many times. Kingdoms have come and gone. Roads have shifted. Faiths have flourished, faded, returned, and changed shape. Empires have raised pillars. Monks have walked in search of shelter. Farmers have worked the soil, and travellers have passed through without knowing that inside the nearby rock were chambers polished more finely than many palace floors. That is part of the quiet power of the place. The caves do not appear as a single grand monument placed in the middle of an empty ceremonial plain. They are set into a living landscape. The ancient and the everyday site close together, which is often how history really survives, not apart from life, but beside it. If you were approaching the hills in the 3rd century BCE, the world around you would have been very different, but the stone would already have been old beyond human measure. The granite had formed deep within the earth long before there were kingdoms, inscriptions, monks, or anyone available to complain about the heat. By the time Mauryan builders arrived with tools, labour plans and orders, the hills had already endured an age of weather. They were not waiting to become architecture. They were simply there, and that makes the decision to cut rooms into them all the more interesting. Ancient builders had choices. They could build from brick. They could build from timber. They could use softer stone in other places. They could make shelters in natural caves if they found suitable ones. Instead, here they chose living granite. A doorway cut into a hill is different from a doorway built in a wall. A built doorway is added to the world. A rock-cut doorway is removed from it. It begins with a face of stone that has no opening, No welcome, no promise of shelter. Then someone marks a place. Someone decides where the entrance should be. Tools strike, chips fall, dust gathers. The hill begins, very slowly, to accept a human decision. That is easy to say and difficult to picture properly, because modern life hides effort from us. We press buttons and things move. We click icons and images change. We order something, and a machine somewhere cuts, shapes, wraps, and dispatches it, while we wonder why delivery is taking a whole 2 days. The Barabar Caves belong to a world where stone yielded only through repeated action. Every inch mattered. Every mark had to be made physically. The first doorway into these caves is not only an architectural feature, it is a change in atmosphere. Outside there is heat, sky, wind, birds, people, and the uneven surface of the hill. Inside there is granite, darkness, coolness, and sound. The transition must have been immediate. One moment the body is in daylight, and the next it enters a space where light is reduced, edges sharpen, and the air feels enclosed. A cave is not simply a room with stone walls. It changes how you behave. Most people lower their voices when they enter one, even if nobody has asked them to. The body understands enclosure before the mind has finished describing it. You step in, and some ancient part of you pays attention. This is especially true at Barabar because these interiors are not rough caverns. They do not have the irregular surfaces of a natural cave, where rock has cracked, dripped, and folded itself over long periods. The famous Barabar chambers are deliberate, their walls are smoothed. Their ceilings are shaped. Their surfaces have a high polish that can look almost wet in certain light. In places, the rooms are so plain that they become more surprising than decoration would have been. There are not many visual distractions. There are no crowds of carved figures telling stories across the walls. Instead, the architecture places you in a controlled stone environment where the main features are shape, surface, darkness, and echo. It is simple in the way a well-made instrument is simple, not empty, focused. One of the caves often mentioned first is Sudama, and with good reason. Its plan helps us understand the Barabar experience. It has an entrance leading into a rectangular chamber, and beyond that, an inner chamber with a rounded form and vaulted roof. The outer space is polished. The surfaces catch light. The inner room changes the feeling again, because rounded spaces handle sound differently from flat ones. A person entering such a chamber would not need a lecture on acoustics to notice something unusual. Speak, chant, hum, or cough, and the cave responds. The sound comes back from the hard walls with a clarity and strength that can feel startling. Even today, visitors often notice the echo before they understand the architecture. Imagine entering with a small lamp, not electric light spreading evenly and flattening the mystery, but a flame. A flame does not reveal everything. It moves. It sends brightness across one polished surface and leaves another in shadow. On a rough wall, light scatters. On polished granite, it slides. The cave would not have glowed like a modern room, but the reflections must have mattered. The darkness would have seemed active, interrupted by gleams from the walls, the ceiling, and perhaps the floor. The result would have been controlled but not comfortable in the ordinary sense. These spaces were not designed for lounging about with cushions, snacks, and a relaxed conversation about the weather. They were made for ascetics, for people who had chosen discipline, restraint, and inward attention. The cave supported that mood. It removed the ordinary world, then returned every sound with interest. Kana Chopar, another of the Barabar Caves, is different in its arrangement. It is described as a single rectangular chamber with a vaulted roof and polished surfaces. A simpler plan, perhaps, but simplicity here is not a lack of sophistication. A rectangular chamber cut into granite with a vaulted ceiling is not a casual achievement. The more plain the form, the less room there is to hide errors. Decoration can sometimes distract from unevenness. A bare polished surface does the opposite. It reveals. It asks the stoneworker to be accurate because light will show every change. That is one reason these caves continue to trouble the imagination. Rough ancient work can be admired at a distance. Highly finished ancient work feels closer, almost confrontational. It says, "Look carefully, we knew what we were doing." Then there is Lomus Rishi, perhaps the best known of the group because of its carved entrance. The facade has a graceful arched form often compared to early wooden architectural styles, with a shape that later becomes important in Indian rock-cut architecture. It is a doorway that seems to remember timber, even though it is cut in stone. That detail is important because it suggests that the builders were not inventing in isolation. They were translating known forms into a more permanent material. Many early buildings in the Indian subcontinent were made from materials that do not survive well: wood, bamboo, thatch, packed earth. By cutting certain shapes into granite, the builders preserved echoes of architecture that may otherwise have vanished. Stone, in this sense, becomes a witness not only to itself, but to materials that are gone. The facade at Lomus Rishi also changes the emotional experience of approaching the cave. A plain opening in a rock face can feel severe. A carved entrance suggests intention, identity, and perhaps invitation. Yet the interior beyond remains austere. This contrast between a marked doorway and a dark chamber is important. The outside addresses the visitor. The inside removes the visitor from ordinary sight. It is like being welcomed and then silenced, though not in a harsh way. More in the way a library silences you when you step between tall shelves and suddenly remember that your phone volume has been far too confident. Not every cave in the group is finished in the same way. Some are more complete than others. Some carry later inscriptions. Some show the marks of different periods of use or attention. This matters because the Barabar Hills were not frozen after the Mauryan period. Places with religious significance often continue to attract visitors, worshippers, reusers, scribes, and local traditions. A site can begin with one purpose and accumulate others. The oldest layer may be Mauryan and Ajivika, but later centuries leave their own traces. This is one of the challenges in understanding ancient spaces. We want them to speak with one clear voice, but they often speak like a room where many conversations happened over many years, and the last person forgot to close the door. Still, the earliest phase is the one that draws us inward tonight, because it is the earliest phase that created the polished granite chambers. And when we think about those first workers, it is worth removing one common habit from the mind. We should not imagine ancient builders as vague, anonymous people with simple tools and simple ideas. They were specialists. They understood stone through touch, sound, fracture, and experience. A skilled stoneworker can read a rock face the way a musician reads an instrument. They know where a blow will travel. They know when a surface is changing. They can hear differences. They can feel resistance. They can judge what is possible by memory and practice. The fact that they did not use modern machines does not mean they were guessing. It means their expertise belonged to a different relationship with material. Granite would have made that relationship demanding. To hollow out a chamber, workers may have used iron tools, hammerstones, pointed implements, chisels, and repeated abrasion. The process likely involved rough cutting first, then shaping, then finer smoothing, and finally polishing with increasingly fine abrasives. But those general terms do not capture the endurance involved. Rough cutting granite means removing material that does not want to be removed. Shaping it into a controlled interior means coordinating many blows over a large surface. Polishing it means returning again and again to the same wall after the dramatic part of excavation is already done. That last stage is especially revealing. Many projects stop when a space becomes usable. Barabar did not stop at usable. Someone wanted refined. The reason may partly lie in Mauryan imperial taste. The Mauryan period produced famous polished stonework, including pillars associated with Ashoka. These pillars show that high polish was not unique to the caves, but part of a broader courtly and technical tradition. The Barabar interiors take that polished finish and apply it to an architectural void. Instead of polishing a pillar that stands in the open air, they polish the inside of the hill. That changes the meaning of the finish. A pillar communicates outward. A cave surrounds inward. In a cave, polish affects not only appearance, but the whole physical experience. It changes light, sound, touch, and mood. There is also a practical question. Why choose these hills? Why this granite? Partly perhaps because the rock was there, solid and suitable for excavation. Partly because the location was within a region of intense religious activity, not far from places linked to major spiritual movements. Nearby Gaia and the wider Magadha region had enormous religious importance. This was a landscape where renunciant communities could plausibly seek retreat, patronage, and association with sacred geography. A cave in such a landscape was not merely shelter, it was withdrawal made visible. It allowed a person to step out of ordinary life without leaving the world entirely. And the first doorway into darkness would have carried that meaning. For an ascetic, entering the cave may have been a movement away from heat, noise, social life, and daily obligation. For a royal patron, providing such a cave may have been an act of religious support and public generosity. For the workers, it may have been a commission of unusual difficulty and prestige. For us, looking back from a very different world, it becomes all of those things at once, plus a puzzle. We see the doorway and ask how. We see the polish and ask why. We hear about the echoes and wonder whether sound was intended from the beginning. We read the inscriptions and try to place living people behind the letters. One thing that makes the Barabar Caves so striking is their scale of effort compared with their plainness. Many ancient monuments announce effort through size or decoration. A large temple complex, a pyramid, a fortified wall, a huge statue. These tell the viewer immediately that labour has been gathered and displayed. Barabar is quieter. The rooms are not huge by the standards of world monuments. They do not overwhelm through mass alone. Their effort is hidden in the hardness of the material and the refinement of the finish. It is not the amount of space that astonishes first, but the quality of the space. A small polished granite chamber can be more unsettling than a much larger rough one, because it implies a different kind of obsession. There is also the matter of darkness itself. Modern visitors often experience ancient sites through photographs, and photographs can mislead gently. A good photograph of a cave interior may be lit by flash or artificial lamps, showing the polish clearly. It lets us see the surfaces in a way ancient users may rarely have seen them all at once, but the original experience would have been darker, slower, and more dependent on movement. A person would not simply stand back and take in the whole chamber as an image. They would enter, adjust, listen, watch the lamp move, and become aware of the room gradually. The cave would reveal itself by steps. That kind of experience matters, especially in a place used for religious discipline. Darkness is not just absence of light. In a controlled space, darkness changes attention. It is easy to imagine that the first doorway into such darkness was psychologically powerful. The outside world has distance. You can look across fields, up at the sky, toward other people. Inside the cave, distance contracts. The walls are close. The ceiling curves overhead. Sound returns. The body feels enclosed. The mind has fewer distractions. For someone meditating, chanting, or sheltering during the rainy season, this could become a place of intense focus. For someone unprepared, it might feel eerie. Both reactions are human. A cave can comfort and unsettle at the same time. It can feel like protection and like being swallowed. Barabar seems to understand that balance very well, whether by deliberate design, accumulated use, or the unavoidable power of polished stone. We should also notice how the caves sit between nature and architecture. They are not natural caves simply adopted by humans, but they are not freestanding buildings either. They are hybrid things, made by cutting human intention into geological mass. This gives them a different authority. A brick building can fall apart and be rebuilt. A timber hall can burn and be replaced. A rock-cut chamber feels as though it belongs to the hill, even when its surfaces are clearly artificial. The builders did not bring the stone to the site. They entered the stone where it already was. That makes the finished room feel both made and discovered, as if it had been waiting inside the hill all along, which of course it had not, unless Granite has an unusually patient sense of interior design. The Barabar Hills also remind us that the oldest surviving examples of a tradition are not necessarily the first examples that ever existed. Rock-cut architecture in India later becomes vast and spectacular in places such as Ajanta, Ellora, Kala and many others. Those later monuments are more elaborate, filled with pillars, halls, cells, sculptures, paintings and devotional imagery. Barabar stands near the beginning of that surviving story. It is earlier, plainer, harder, and in some ways more mysterious, because it has not yet become the full temple or monastery complex we expect from later rock-cut sites. It feels like a starting point, but not a crude one. More like a highly focused experiment whose results were never fully repeated in quite the same way. That combination can confuse us. We expect beginnings to look rough, but Barabar suggests that the beginning of surviving rock-cut architecture in India already involved a high level of ambition. This may be because the technical knowledge came from other forms of stonework, perhaps from the making of polished pillars, perhaps from traditions that have left fewer traces, or it may be because court-sponsored projects could gather the best available skill for a very specific purpose. We cannot know every step with certainty, but we can see the result. A polished cave cut into granite is not a beginner's mistake, it is a statement. As we stand at that first doorway in the mind, the scene becomes more concrete. There is the outside face of the hill, rough and weathered. There is the shaped entrance made by hands. There is the sudden darkness beyond it. There is the knowledge that the room inside is not irregular, not accidental, not simply found, but made. There is the cool air, the hard floor, the polish catching the smallest light, and the sound of a footstep returning too clearly. The doorway is not only an entrance into stone, it is an entrance into a world where imperial power, religious discipline, geology, craftsmanship, and unanswered questions meet in a space small enough to stand in, but old enough to make ordinary time feel a little thin. And this is why the hills themselves matter. Without them, the caves become isolated curiosities, strange rooms floating in photographs. With the hills, they become part of a landscape, granite rising from Bihar's earth, ancient roads and religious movements nearby, a Mauryan emperor whose reach extended across regions, a vanished sect receiving spaces that still outlast almost everything written by or about them, workers cutting into stone that had no natural reason to become smooth, visitors entering darkness and finding not rough shelter, but a chamber polished like a dark mirror. The first doorway does not answer the mystery. It teaches us how to approach it, slowly, with attention, and with the understanding that the stone is not impressive because it is impossible, but because it is real, and because real things made with such care can be much harder to explain than legends. From that entrance, the story begins to narrow. The hills give us the setting. The granite gives us the challenge. The doorway gives us the first change of atmosphere. But behind the making of these chambers was a human world just as complicated as the stone was hard. There was a ruler whose name became one of the most famous in Indian history. There was an empire learning how to speak through inscriptions, and there was a religious community once influential, now almost gone from memory, for whom these dark, polished rooms were made. Behind those dark entrances was not only a building project, but a world of kings, wandering teachers, arguments about destiny, and a religious movement that once mattered enough to receive rooms cut into granite by order of an emperor. That is one of the quiet surprises of Barabar. The caves look at first like a mystery of engineering. You notice the polish, you notice the hard stone, you notice the strange echo and the clean lines. But the moment you ask who the rooms were made for, the story shifts from tools and granite into something more human. The chambers were not made for storage, they were not made for soldiers, they were not made as royal bedrooms, which is a relief. because sleeping in a cold, echoing granite chamber would make even the most powerful emperor reconsider his interior design choices. They were made, at least in their earliest known purpose, for ascetics known as the Ajivikas. To understand why that matters, we need to spend a little time with Ashoka, because his name stands like a stone pillar in this story. Ashoka was the great Mauryan emperor of the 3rd century BCE, remembered across South Asian history as a ruler who turned moral teaching into public policy and public writing into imperial presence. He ruled over a vast empire, one that stretched across much of the Indian subcontinent, and he left behind something rare for an ancient king: words carved into stone. His inscriptions, placed on rock faces and pillars, do not read like ordinary royal boasting. They are not simply lists of victories, enemies defeated, wealth displayed, and everyone politely reminded that the king was marvellous. Instead, many of Ashoka's inscriptions speak of Dhamma, a broad moral order involving restraint, respect, non-violence, care for people and animals, obedience to parents, generosity, and tolerance toward different sects. It is not that Ashoka stopped being a king and became everyone's kindly uncle with excellent handwriting. He was still an emperor. But he chose to present kingship through moral instruction in a way that remains unusual and powerful. The usual story told about Ashoka begins with conquest and regret. The Kalinga War, fought after his accession, is traditionally described as a turning point. The suffering caused by that conflict is said to have deeply affected him, and his later inscriptions emphasize restraint, compassion, and moral governance. Whether every detail of that transformation unfolded exactly as later traditions present, it is a matter for historians, but the broad outline is clear enough. Ashoka wanted to be remembered not merely as a conqueror, but as a ruler concerned with ethical life. He communicated this concern by carving messages into durable stone. That choice matters at Barabar, because the caves themselves are also stone made to speak, though in a quieter way. Ashoka's empire was not religiously simple. It was not a neat map divided into tidy boxes marked Buddhist here, Jain there, Ajivika over there. Please remove your sandals before entering. The religious landscape of ancient Magadha and the wider Ganges plain was crowded with teachers, renunciants, debate, discipline, and philosophical competition. This was the world in which Buddhism and Jainism developed, but they were not alone. There were Brahmanical traditions, local cults, wandering ascetics, materialist thinkers, skeptics, ritual specialists, forest renouncers, and groups whose names survive only in scattered references. Ideas moved along roads and through towns, into courts, forests, monasteries, and caves. A person seeking truth could encounter many teachings, some practical, some severe, some subtle, and some probably delivered by a man who had not had a comfortable meal in years, but was very sure he had understood the universe. Among these groups were the Ajivikas. Today they are the most ghostly presence in the Barabar story. They were once significant enough to be noticed by Buddhists and Jains, and significant enough to receive royal patronage from Ashoka and later Mauryan rulers, yet their own literature has not survived in a clear body of texts. We do not have an Ajivika canon waiting neatly on a shelf, explaining their practices, their rituals, their songs, their arguments, and what they thought about polished granite acoustics. Instead, we meet them mostly through references made by others, especially from traditions that competed with them. This is a difficult way to reconstruct a faith. It is like trying to learn about someone from their rivals' complaints, with the added challenge that everyone involved has been dead for more than 2,000 years. The founder or major early teacher associated with the Ajivikas is usually named Makali Gosala, a figure placed in the same broad period as the Buddha and Mahavira. Ancient sources connect him with a life of wandering asceticism and with teachings about destiny. The Ajivikas are often described as holding a strong form of determinism, the belief that events unfold according to a fixed cosmic order, not simply by personal effort or moral choice in the ordinary sense. In simple terms, if Buddhists emphasize the path of conduct and insight, and Jains emphasize strict ethical discipline and the purification of the soul, the Ajivikas seem to have believed that life moved according to an unavoidable pattern. The universe, in this view, was not waiting for your suggestions. It had its own schedule, and you were already on it. That idea may sound bleak to modern ears. We like to think we are choosing, improving, progressing, becoming the captain of our own little boat, even if the boat is mostly emails and laundry. A doctrine of strict fate can feel uncomfortable, because it seems to reduce human freedom. But ancient religious ideas should not be judged too quickly by modern instinct. For an ascetic, belief in cosmic determinism may have offered a different kind of seriousness. It may have framed life as part of an immense unfolding order, one not easily changed by desire, fear, or ordinary ambition. If everything moves according to a larger law, then the work of the seeker might not be to control life, but to understand, endure, and withdraw from illusion. That is only a cautious reconstruction, because the Ajivikas remain hard to know from the inside. Still, it gives us a way to imagine why a silent, polished, dark chamber might have suited them. An Ajivika ascetic was not likely to seek comfort in the usual sense. Like other renunciants of the period, Ajivikas probably lived with restraint, discipline, and distance from household life. They may have wandered for much of the year and needed shelter during the rainy season. In ancient India, the monsoon shaped religious practice in practical ways. Wandering during heavy rains could be difficult, dangerous, and damaging to small living things underfoot, so ascetics often stayed in one place for a period. A cave offered shelter, but at Barabar the shelter was far more carefully made than a simple refuge needed to be. This is where the mystery becomes sharper. If the goal was only to keep people dry, a rougher cave would have done the job. Granite does not need a mirror polish to stop rain. It has many faults perhaps, but being too absorbent is not usually one of them. So why would Ashoka grant such spaces to the Ajivikas? The answer may lie partly in his policy of religious support and respect for multiple sects. Ashoka is often remembered as a Buddhist ruler, and there is strong evidence of his personal support for Buddhism. But his inscriptions also speak in broad terms, calling for respect across religious communities. He was not simply funding one group and ignoring all others. The empire contained many traditions, and a wise ruler had reasons to manage that diversity with care. Patronage was not just generosity, it was also a way of organising relationships between court and religious communities. When an emperor donated a cave, he was not merely handing over a useful room. He was making a public statement in stone. This group is recognised, this space is granted, this act is tied to royal authority. At Barabar, that royal authority appears in inscriptions. In the Sudama cave, an inscription associated with Ashoka's 12th regnal year records the dedication of the cave to the Ajivikas. Other inscriptions in the Barabar group are also linked to Ashoka and to later moments in his reign. Nearby, in the Nagarjuni hills, caves were dedicated by Dasharatha, Ashoka's grandson and successor, also to the Ajivikas. This continuity matters. It suggests that support for the Ajivikas was not a one-time accident, not a forgotten favour granted after a particularly persuasive conversation in court. It was part of a pattern of Mauryan patronage. The Ajivikas had standing. They were not marginal eccentrics hiding in the background. At least for a time, they were close enough to power that one of the most impressive stone projects of the age was made for them. And yet, where are they now? That is the melancholy part of the story. Buddhism spread across Asia and left vast textual, artistic and monastic traditions. Jainism continued in India and preserved rich lineages, scriptures, temples and communities. The Ajivikas, by contrast, gradually disappeared as a living tradition. References to them continue for centuries in scattered ways, but eventually the faith fades from view. Its own voice is mostly lost. We are left with fragments, inscriptions, mentions by others, and these astonishing caves. That makes Barabar feel less like a monument to a well-known religion, and more like a polished stone envelope addressed to someone whose house no longer exists. There is something especially strange about a vanished faith leaving behind such durable architecture. Beliefs, conversations, chants, and daily practices can disappear. A teaching repeated for generations can fall silent if no one copies it, teaches it, or lives by it. But stone remains. Not perfectly, of course. Stone erodes, cracks, gets reused, defaced, misunderstood, and sometimes has modern visitors leaning on it for photographs despite everyone being asked very nicely not to. Still, stone has a stubbornness that memory does not. The Ajivikas vanished, but the rooms made for them survived. So when we enter Barabar, we are not only entering ancient architecture, we are entering one of the few remaining physical traces of a community whose inner world is mostly gone. That absence changes how the caves feel. If we knew exactly how the Ajivikas used the chambers, if we had detailed accounts of their ceremonies, meditation practices, chants, sleeping arrangements, rules, arguments, and whether anyone complained about the echo at breakfast, the mystery would be different. But we do not. We know enough to connect the caves to them, not enough to fully restore their lives. The result is a space full of facts and silence at the same time. Ashoka's name gives us a date. The inscriptions give us a dedication. Archaeology gives us the material. But the human experience inside the rooms remains partly hidden. Still, we can reason carefully. These caves were likely not places for large congregations in the way later religious halls could be. Their interiors are comparatively small and austere. They may have functioned as retreats or shelters for ascetics, especially during the rains. The polished walls and echoing form may have intensified practices involving sound or meditation, whether by design or by discovered use. In an ascetic context, darkness and enclosure were not inconveniences. They could be tools. A polished chamber without decoration offers very little for the eyes to consume. It removes ordinary visual distraction. The hard walls return the voice, making sound more present. The person inside is placed in a setting where the body, breath, and mind cannot easily escape into the usual busyness of the world. This fits the wider world of ancient renunciation. Many Indian ascetic traditions treated ordinary life as entangling. Family, property, food, comfort, status, praise, argument, memory, fear, and desire all pulled the person outward. To renounce was not merely to move house, it was to change one's relationship with the world. A cave helped make that change physical. You stepped away from daylight and society into stone. You left the open landscape and entered a space with one way in, one way out, and not much to do except sit, listen, breathe, chant, think, or sleep very carefully on hard surfaces. If that sounds severe, it was probably meant to be. Asceticism is not usually designed around making everyone feel cozy by modern hotel standards. There is rarely a breakfast buffet, and yet the Barabar Caves are not crude punishment cells. That is what makes them so interesting. They are severe but refined, empty but highly finished, plain but technically demanding. Their austerity is not the austerity of neglect. It is the austerity of care. Someone went to immense trouble to create spaces that did almost nothing in the ordinary decorative sense, but did that almost nothing with extraordinary precision. That tells us something about the value placed on the environment of renunciation. The Ajivikas may have rejected luxury, but the royal gift given to them was not casual. The cave was worthy because it was permanent, cleanly formed, and perhaps spiritually powerful. It did not flatter the senses with imagery. It disciplined them with surface, sound, and darkness. Ashoka's role in this is complicated in the best historical way. He was a ruler, not a mason. He did not personally stand there polishing granite with a cloth and a determined expression, at least as far as we know. But without imperial power, these caves may not have been made in the form we see. The Mauryan state could mobilize resources, it could command labor. It could bring specialists to sites. It could support projects that ordinary communities could not easily fund or organize. The finished caves therefore speak both of religious patronage and political capacity. They are spiritual spaces made possible by empire. That pairing might feel odd, but it is common in history. Renunciants step away from power, and power sometimes builds places for them to step into. The king gains moral prestige. The ascetics gain shelter. The stone gains a very long career. It is also worth noticing that Ashoka's inscriptions helped create a new relationship between ruler and public space. By carving words into stone, he spread his presence across the empire. The king did not need to stand before every person. His message could stand there for him, on a pillar or rock face, in letters that outlasted the officials who arranged them. At Barabar, the inscriptions are shorter and more dedicatory than the Great Moral Edicts, but the principle is similar. Stone carries authority. A cave is not merely used by the Ajivikas, it is given, and that gift is recorded. The inscription transforms the chamber from a hollowed space into a documented act. For the Ajivikas themselves, receiving such a gift may have had several meanings. It provided practical shelter. It marked recognition by the highest authority in the land. It gave them a place in a sacred and intellectual landscape already full of competing traditions. It may also have offered a kind of stability to a group known for wandering. A cave does not wander, it waits. Ascetics may come and go, but the chamber remains. In a religious world where teachings often move through oral transmission, a carved and polished shelter was a fixed point. It gave a mobile community a physical memory. The irony, of course, is that the physical memory survived better than the tradition. We can still stand before the Barabar Caves. We can still trace the letters, study the walls, map the rooms, measure the polish, and record the echoes. But we cannot sit with an Ajivika teacher and ask what the chamber meant. We cannot ask whether the echo was used in chanting, whether the darkness was considered spiritually useful, whether the polish had symbolic meaning, or whether everyone simply thought it was a fine royal finish and left it at that. The questions remain open, and honest history has to let some of them stay that way. This does not weaken the mystery, it makes it more real. A false mystery is one where we ignore evidence so the story stays exciting. A real mystery is one where the evidence is strong but incomplete. Barabar gives us inscriptions, dates, names, political context, religious association, and physical rooms. That is a great deal, but it withholds the working method in detail, the voices of the Ajivikas themselves, and the full meaning of the spaces. We know who granted some of the caves. We know to whom they were granted. We know the broad period and the material achievement. What we do not know is exactly how the builders experienced their own work, how the ascetics used the finished rooms, and why such a high level of finish was considered appropriate for a community devoted to renunciation. It may help to imagine Ashoka not as a simple saintly king or a simple imperial ruler, but as both more human and more political than either label allows. He governed a vast and diverse empire. He used moral language to shape public life. He supported religious communities, including groups beyond his own likely Buddhist commitments. He ordered or authorized inscriptions that remain among the most important historical records of ancient India. And in the Barabar Hills, under his authority, granite chambers were dedicated to a sect whose doctrine of fate seems almost at odds with the very idea of royal action. An emperor commands workers to carve stone for people who may have believed that all events are already determined. That is a wonderfully strange historical knot. Even the granite might have raised an eyebrow, if granite were in the habit of doing so. The Ajivikas bring another important lesson to the caves. They remind us that the ancient past was not simply a preface to the traditions that survived. It was full of alternatives. Some flourished, some vanished, some left texts, some left names, some left only criticism from opponents, some left rooms. When we look back, we often make the mistake of thinking survival equals importance. If a tradition is still alive, we assume it must have been the main one. If a tradition disappeared, we assume it must have been minor. But history is not so tidy. The Ajivikas were important enough in their own time to be discussed, opposed, patronized, and housed in caves made with astonishing skill. Their disappearance tells us about the fragility of memory, not the smallness of their world, and so the Barabar Caves become a rare kind of monument. Not only a monument to what we know, but to what we have lost. Their polished walls do not show scenes from Ajivika teaching. Their inscriptions do not explain doctrine in detail. Their chambers do not preserve the sound of the voices that once moved inside them, yet they hold the outline of a relationship between a great emperor and a forgotten faith. Ashoka's name gives the caves historical weight. The Ajivikas give them their haunting emptiness. Granite gives them durability. The Polish gives them strangeness. The echo gives them a voice without words. From here, the question of construction becomes even more compelling. Because once we understand that these rooms were not random experiments, but royal gifts to a serious ascetic community, the workmanship begins to look less like a technical curiosity and more like an intentional act of devotion, authority, and display. The stone was not just cut, it was disciplined. The hill was not just opened, it was transformed into a place fit for silence, shelter, and perhaps the strange comfort of a faith that believed the universe was moving exactly as it must. And that brings us back to the physical problem waiting inside the granite. How ancient workers, more than 2,300 years ago, cut these chambers from living rock with such control that the walls still seem to challenge the hand that made them. The moment we stop looking at the Barabar Caves as mysterious photographs and begin thinking of them as work sites, the whole story becomes heavier, not less interesting. Heavier in the hands, heavier in the shoulders, heavier in the imagination. Because a polished granite chamber is easy to admire from a distance, especially when it appears on a screen, framed neatly, lit just enough to show the famous shine, and separated from the sweat, sound, dust, and force that made it possible. But every one of those smooth walls began as unbroken stone. Every curve began as resistance. Every clean surface began with impact. Before the cave was silent, it must have been deafening. Granite is not a material that gives compliments easily. It is hard, crystalline, dense, and slow to change. It is made from minerals that lock together in a tough pattern, and that pattern is exactly why granite can survive so long as a building stone. It is durable, but durability is a rather inconvenient quality when your plan is to remove a great deal of it by hand. Softer rocks can be carved more readily. Sandstone, limestone, and certain volcanic stones can be shaped with less effort. Granite demands more. It blunts tools. It sends shock back through the arm. It chips in ways that must be understood. It does not forgive careless work, and it certainly does not politely become a room just because an emperor has had a good idea. This is why the Barabar Caves are so important to approach slowly. When we say they were carved into granite more than 2,300 years ago, the sentence is neat and tidy, but the reality is not. That sentence contains planning, surveying, tool-making, labour, organisation, fatigue, injury, skill, and an amount of patience that most of us would lose somewhere between the first hour and the first stubborn corner. We're used to modern construction being fast enough that inconvenience becomes the main thing we notice. A road repair takes 2 weeks and everyone sighs deeply. A kitchen renovation runs late and the household feels it has entered a historical crisis. But the work at Barabar belonged to a different rhythm, one in which stone was persuaded through repetition. To cut a room from living granite, the builders first had to decide where the room would be. That sounds obvious, but in rock-cut architecture, planning is unusually unforgiving. In a building made from separate blocks, you can adjust as you go. You can add a wall, remove a timber, rework an opening, cover a mistake, or ask everyone to agree that the slight irregularity gives the place character. In a cave, the material is already there in one enormous mass. The builders do not assemble the room, they subtract it. Once too much stone is removed, it cannot simply be put back. If a ceiling is cut badly, if a chamber is misaligned, if a surface is taken too far, The hill does not offer spare granite in a convenient drawer. The work must begin with a mental room hidden inside the rock, and then the task is to reveal it without ruining it. That is a very different kind of making. A carpenter builds outward. A potter shapes around. A mason stacks. A cave cutter removes. The finished space is a controlled absence. The walls are not placed where they are. They remain where the workers decided to stop cutting. The ceiling exists because stone above it was left intact. The doorway appears because stone that once blocked the way was taken away. In this sense, a rock-cut cave is a kind of negative sculpture, and Barabar is one of the earliest and most refined surviving examples of that art in India. The builders were not only making surfaces, they were making emptiness with exact boundaries. The first stage must have been rough and brutal. Marks would be laid out on the rock face. Workers would attack the stone with hammering, pointed tools and controlled blows. They may have used iron implements, stone hammers, wedges, abrasives, and techniques known through long practice, although the exact sequence is still debated. What matters for the imagination is that this was not delicate at first. Large amounts of stone had to be removed before any smooth chamber could exist. The sound would have carried across the hillside, metal on stone on stone, voices, orders, chips falling, dust scraping underfoot. The polished silence we admire today was born from noise. Inside the growing cavity, the work would have become harder in another way. Outside, a person can swing freely. Inside a partially excavated chamber, space becomes limited. Light becomes poor, dust gathers, heat behaves differently. The air does not clear as easily. Every worker must judge surfaces under conditions that are not naturally helpful. Imagine trying to carve a room while standing inside the unfinished room, surrounded by stone, with the ceiling slowly taking shape above you and the exit behind you. The work is physical, but it is also spatial. The builders must constantly understand where they are inside the hill, and then there is the ceiling. Several Barabar chambers are known for their vaulted forms, the kind of curved roof that makes the interior feel less like a simple box and more like an architectural space. A vaulted ceiling cut from living rock is not something you add after the walls are done. It must be carved as part of the whole excavation. The curve has to be judged and corrected as material is removed. Too flat and the intended form is lost. Too deep, and the ceiling may become uneven or structurally concerning. Too rough, and the polish later will reveal every awkward decision. A vault in stone can look effortless when finished, but effortlessness is often the most labour-intensive illusion in architecture. In Sudama, for example, the arrangement of outer and inner spaces gives a sense of deliberate planning. There is a rectangular hall and a rounded inner chamber with a domed or vaulted quality. This is not a random hollow. It is an organised sequence. The visitor moves from one space to another, from the more rectangular to the more enclosed and rounded. That movement matters because it shows that the builders were thinking beyond mere shelter. If all they needed was a dry room, a simpler cavity would have worked. Instead, they shaped different zones within the granite. They created a passage of experience and the stone had to obey. Khana Chowpar shows a different kind of control, a single rectangular chamber with a vaulted roof and polished surfaces. There is a quiet discipline in that plan. It does not rely on complexity to impress. It relies on accuracy. Plain rectangular rooms can be unforgiving because they make unevenness visible. When a surface is rough, the eye accepts irregularity. When a surface is highly polished, the eye begins to judge it. Light will catch humps, dips, scratches, tool marks, and changes in angle. Polishing therefore raises the standard of the entire excavation. It is not something you simply apply at the end to make everything look better, like putting a clean tablecloth over a questionable dinner. The underlying form has to be prepared for it. This is one of the reasons Barabar feels so strange. The polish is not a decoration added onto a crude cave. It is integrated into the whole ambition of the space. The walls had to be cut, then shaped, then smoothed, then polished. Each stage depends on the one before it. If the rough cutting was inaccurate, later smoothing would require more correction. If the surface was left too uneven, polishing would expose the problem. If the chamber proportions were poorly handled, the acoustic and visual effects would shift. The finished cave represents not one skill, but a chain of skills, each one carried forward until the granite interior became something close to architectural silence. The polishing itself remains one of the great fascinations of the site. Mauryan polish is famous in Indian art and archaeology, seen on pillars and other stone objects from the period. At Barabar, that high finish appears across cave interiors, which is unusual because the surfaces are large, curved and enclosed. To polish a pillar is already demanding. To polish the inside of a granite chamber is another kind of commitment altogether. The workers would have had to grind the surfaces with abrasives, probably beginning with coarser materials and moving toward finer ones. They may have used sand, mineral powders, rubbing stones, water and repeated motion. But again, the general explanation does not fully satisfy the eye. We can say abrasive polishing. We can say skilled labour. We can say Mauryan technique. And still, when the wall gleams, the mind asks for the missing details. How long did it take? How many people worked at once? What exact abrasives were used? How were curved surfaces kept so smooth? How did they judge the final finish in low light? Did one group specialise in rough cutting while another handled polishing? Was there a master stoneworker walking through the chamber, touching the wall and quietly ruining everyone's afternoon by saying, "Not yet"? These questions matter because ancient craftsmanship often disappears behind finished objects. We inherit the result, not the workshop. The Barabar Caves do not come with toolboxes left neatly by the door. They do not give us a daily record. Today we polish the north wall. Morale is mixed. Lunch was lentils. So we reconstruct from marks, inscriptions, comparisons, geological knowledge, and what is known of Mauryan stoneworking. The lack of a complete technical manual creates space for speculation, and speculation is not always a bad thing if it is kept on a leash. It helps us ask better questions. It becomes a problem only when it leaps over evidence and starts declaring that ancient humans could not possibly have done what is plainly in front of us. A better response is wonder with respect. Ancient builders did not need modern machines to be brilliant. They needed time, training, organisation, and a culture that valued the result enough to pay for the effort. The Mauryan state could supply some of that structure. An imperial project could draw together labour and expertise in a way small groups could not. There may have been stoneworkers already experienced in polishing royal pillars or other hard stone objects. There may have been inherited knowledge from earlier traditions that used wood, brick and stone in ways not fully preserved. There may have been experimentation on site, and there was certainly persistence, which is the least glamorous technology in history and often the most powerful. Persistence can be underestimated because it does not sound mysterious. If someone says an ancient object was made by unknown energy beams, people sit forward. If someone says it was made by skilled workers repeating difficult actions for a very long time, people sometimes feel slightly disappointed, as if patience is too ordinary to explain greatness. But patience at scale is not ordinary. Organised labour over months or years is a form of technology. So is tool maintenance. So is knowledge of abrasives. So is the ability to plan a chamber before it exists. So is the discipline to keep polishing after the surface already looks good enough to most people. The Barabar Caves are not less impressive if they were made by human effort. They are more impressive because they were. Consider the practical sequence. First, the entrance must be opened. Then the interior mass must be removed, probably from front to back, with workers gradually advancing into the rock. The rough chamber must be enlarged and corrected. The walls must be brought toward their intended planes or curves. The ceiling must be shaped. Corners and transitions must be refined. The floor must be levelled enough for use. The surfaces must be rubbed, abraded and smoothed repeatedly. At each stage, light has to be brought in or reflected in some way. Dust has to be cleared. Broken tools must be replaced or repaired. Workers must eat, rest, and return. Supervisors must check progress. The site must be supplied. The project must continue through weather, heat, and the ordinary stubbornness of stone. And when we remember that some caves were dedicated during specific regnal years of Ashoka, the timeline becomes even more vivid. These were not vague prehistoric hollows whose dates float in mist. They belonged to a known imperial period. They were made in a world of administration and record, of royal orders and religious donations. The inscription in Sudama connects its excavation to Ashoka's 12th regnal year, while other caves preserve related records. Dates do not make the work easier, but they do place it in human time. Somewhere in a particular year of a particular reign, people stood at the hill and worked. The cave was not always ancient. Once it was new. That is a useful thing to imagine. A new Barabar Cave. Not weathered, not famous, not visited by archaeologists, not photographed from every angle, but freshly completed. The polish would be sharp, the inscription would be clean, the surfaces would carry the marks of recent labour, even if the final finish hid most of them. The first Ajivika ascetics to enter may have smelled dust and stone. They may have heard their own voices return with startling force. They may have touched the wall and felt the cold smoothness of a royal gift that was also an enclosure. To them, it was not an ancient wonder. It was a new shelter, a new retreat, a new space made for their use. How did the builders handle the sound? That question waits beneath the construction problem. Hard, smooth surfaces reflect sound strongly. Curved chambers can focus, scatter, or prolong echoes depending on their shape. Whether or not the acoustic effects were fully calculated in a modern sense, the physical properties of the space were produced by choices. Smooth granite is reflective not only to light, but to sound. A vaulted room behaves differently from a rough natural cavity. A rounded inner chamber creates a different auditory experience from a flat-walled hall. If the users chanted, recited, or meditated with sound, the cave could have amplified the experience. If the builders noticed this while shaping the rooms, perhaps they refined it. Or perhaps the sound emerged from architectural choices made for other reasons, then became part of the cave's power. In ancient architecture, intention and discovery often live together. The challenge of working granite also raises the question of unfinished spaces. Visvajopri, for example, includes an outer apartment with high polish and an inner circular chamber described as unfinished. That contrast is valuable. A finished surface tells us what the builders could achieve. An unfinished surface can show us something of the process left incomplete. It reminds us that these caves did not appear in a single magical moment. They were projects with stages. Some parts reached the intended finish, others did not. The presence of unfinished work is one of the best arguments against fantasies of effortless lost technology. It shows labour in progress, human limitation, interruption, or changing plans. If the caves were simply produced by some impossible device, one might expect a different pattern. Instead, we see the reality of ancient making, ambition, success, and incomplete edges. That does not diminish the mystery of the finished chambers, it deepens it. Because the unfinished areas help us understand how far the finished ones had to go. They show the distance between rough excavation and the polished final surface. They let us appreciate the final polish not as a surface trick, but as the last stage of a long transformation. The builders were not merely carving, they were converting hard geological mass into architectural experience. The human body was at the centre of this work. Hands held tools, eyes judged surfaces, ears heard changes in the ring of stone, backs bent, shoulders absorbed shock. Dust entered lungs, skin felt heat outside and coolness inside. We often talk about ancient engineering as if it were only mathematics and materials, but it was also bodies. The cave is the fossil of labour. Every smooth wall is a record of repeated motion. Every curve is a record of judgment. The silence inside the cave is not empty. It is full of work that has stopped. There is a strange intimacy in that. When you touch a polished ancient wall, you're close to the movement of people who lived more than 2,000 years ago. Not in a mystical way, though it can feel that way. In a practical way. Their actions shape the surface your hand meets. The stone between you has not been replaced. The same granite resisted them and now receives you. That continuity is one reason rock-cut architecture can feel so powerful. A brick can be moved, a wall can be rebuilt, but a cave cut into a hill preserves the original relationship between place and work. The builders did not just leave an object, they altered the hill. At Barabar, the alteration is precise enough to raise modern eyebrows. The chambers are not huge by the standards of later monuments, but their finish gives them an intensity that size alone cannot create. Standing in one, you are surrounded by evidence of exacting effort. The smoothness removes visual noise. The polish makes the wall feel almost unnatural. The vault overhead suggests intention. The echo makes the room respond. And because the stone is granite, every one of these qualities feels earned. This is not a soft cave dressed up to look impressive. This is one of Earth's harder materials turned into a quiet chamber for a vanished sect, under the authority of an emperor whose name still survives. It is tempting to imagine the workers feeling pride when the chamber was finished. Perhaps some did. Perhaps others were simply relieved. Ancient labour was not always voluntary in the modern sense, and we should not romanticize every project as a cheerful gathering of artisans, humming pleasantly while making history. Large state works could involve obligation, hierarchy, and hard conditions. The caves are beautiful, but beauty does not erase labour's difficulty. Still, skill leaves its own dignity. Whoever made these rooms understood the stone at a high level. Even if their names are lost, their competence remains visible. That loss of names is one of history's old habits. Kings sign, workers vanish. Ashoka's inscriptions survive, and rightly so, because they are enormously important. But the people who shape the granite do not introduce themselves. No wall says, polished by Devadatta, who would like everyone to know this took longer than expected. No ceiling records the team that corrected the curve. No doorway lists the tool makers who supplied the iron. We have the royal name and the religious dedication, but not the workshop, and so the caves become a monument to anonymous expertise. The silence is partly architectural and partly social. The deeper we think about the cutting of the rooms, the more the word perfect needs careful handling. The Barabar Caves are often described in excited language, as if they are impossibly perfect or machined beyond human ability. In truth, like all human-made things, they have variations, unfinished areas, weathering, and complexities. But perfection in this context does not need to mean absolute mathematical flawlessness. It means something more interesting, a level of finish and control that feels unexpected for its age and material. The caves are too refined for our lazy assumptions, not too refined for human hands. That distinction matters. The mystery should enlarge ancient people, not erase them. More than 2,300 years is a long time for assumptions to gather. We look backward through layers of later architecture, colonial archaeology, modern technology, internet speculation, and our own habits of comparison. We see the polished wall and compare it with machine work. But the builders did not think in those terms. They were not trying to impress the 21st century. They were solving a problem within their own world. How to create a durable, suitable, perhaps spiritually charged shelter in granite for an ascetic community under royal patronage. Their methods were ancient, but their standards were not low. The result still unsettles us because it does not ask for our permission to be sophisticated. The cutting of the Barabar chambers from living granite therefore becomes more than a construction story. It becomes a correction to the way we imagine the past. It asks us to replace the simple ladder of progress with something more accurate, a landscape of skills, some rising early, some disappearing, some returning in new forms, some tied to specific political and religious moments. The Mauryan ability to polish stone at a high level did not automatically continue everywhere forever. Later, Indian rock-cut architecture developed in other directions, often larger and more sculptural, but not always with the same dark, mirror-like granite finish. A technique can be brilliant and still be historically specific. It can belong to a moment, and Barabar was such a moment. Hard granite hills, imperial command, Ajivika dedication, skilled workers, ascetic use, polished interiors, echoing chambers. The combination is rare, and rarity is part of the mystery. If hundreds of identical polished granite cave complexes had survived across the region, we might admire them differently. But Barabar stands near the beginning of a tradition, and apart from much that followed. It feels like a door opened, perfected in a particular way, and then not quite repeated. So when we imagine the rooms being cut, we should not picture a vague ancient miracle. We should picture a work site under a hard sun. We should hear the strike of tools. We should see dust on skin, chips underfoot, lamps inside the growing hollow, and supervisors judging lines by touch and sight. We should imagine the workers moving from rough force to fine control, from cutting to smoothing, from smoothing to polishing, until the granite no longer looked like the inside of a hill, but like a surface made to hold darkness. That is the real wonder. Not that the caves are beyond human making, but that human making could become this patient, this severe, and this exact. And after the chamber had been cut, after the wall had been brought into shape, after the ceiling had been curved and the floor cleared, there remained the final transformation, the polish. That dark gleam is what most visitors remember. It is what turns a carved cave into something almost unreal. It is the feature that makes the walls seem less like stone and more like still water, black glass or a mirror that has forgotten how to reflect clearly. The cutting made the room possible, but the polish made it unforgettable. The cutting made the rooms possible, but the polish is what makes them feel almost unreasonable. A cave can be impressive because it is old, because it's hard to carve, because it carries an inscription from a famous emperor, or because it belonged to a vanished religious group. Barabar has all of that. But the moment people see the walls shining back at them, the conversation changes. It is no longer only about ancient India, Ashoka, the Ajivikas, or early rock-cut architecture. It becomes about surface, about finish, about the strange fact that more than 2,300 years ago, someone took the inside of a granite hill and made it smooth enough to reflect light. That sounds simple, until you let it sit in the mind for a moment. The inside of a granite hill is not supposed to behave like a mirror. It is supposed to be rough, grainy, stubborn, full of tool marks, uneven edges, and small reminders that stone is not fond of being rearranged. Most caves, even beautiful ones, carry the irregularity of their making. Natural caves have folds, cracks, mineral stains, damp corners, and shapes produced by forces too slow for human patience. Man-made caves usually reveal the hand of the worker in another way. Chisel lines, uneven planes, unfinished spots, surfaces that tell you where force met resistance. But in parts of Barabar, the granite walls seem to have passed through that rough stage and then through another, more demanding stage, and then through yet another, until the stone stopped looking merely carved and began looking finished in the way a precious object is finished. This is the famous Mauryan polish. The phrase appears in discussions of Ashokan pillars, sculptural pieces, and the Barabar Caves, and it describes a high, glossy finish that makes stone look almost liquid under the right light. On sandstone pillars, it is astonishing. On granite cave walls, it is stranger still. A pillar is a single object standing in space. You can move around it. You can polish it from outside. The surface is exposed and accessible. A cave wall is different. It surrounds the worker. It curves overhead. It runs into corners. It retreats into darkness. It is part of a hill. To polish it, you do not bring an object to the workshop. The workshop must move into the object. Imagine the process after the rough excavation had ended. The chamber exists, but it is still not Barabar as we know it. The walls are shaped, perhaps still scratched and uneven. The ceiling has its intended curve. The floor has been cleared. Dust hangs in the air. The workers have already done the task that most people would consider the hard part. They have made a room out of granite. At this point, a perfectly sensible person might say, "Excellent shelter achieved, please let everyone rest." But the makers of Barabar did not stop there. They returned to the walls. They rubbed, ground, smoothed, corrected, and refined. They spent effort not on making the room larger, not on adding decoration, not on carving dozens of figures, but on reducing the surface itself into smoothness. That choice is important. Polish is not merely a technical feature, it is evidence of priority. Every extra hour spent smoothing a granite wall is an hour not spent doing something easier or more visibly decorative. Polishing is slow work. It does not announce progress dramatically. A rough chamber changes quickly when stone is first removed. A wall changes very slowly when it is being brought from smooth to smoother, from dull to glossy, from good enough to startling. The closer the surface gets to finished, the more demanding the process becomes. Large flaws may be corrected early, but the final stages depend on attention to smaller and smaller irregularities. The work becomes less like excavation and more like persuasion. Modern granite polishing uses a sequence of abrasives, usually with powered tools, water, and increasingly fine grades that grind the surface down until it reflects light. Today, we understand that shine is not magic. It is geometry at a tiny scale. A rough surface scatters light in many directions. A polished surface has been smoothed so thoroughly that light reflects more evenly. The eye reads that as gloss. The stone begins to shine because its small unevenness has been reduced. That explanation is straightforward enough in a workshop with machines. It becomes more interesting when you stand inside an ancient cave and remember that this was done by hand, or at least without the modern equipment that now makes granite countertops only moderately inconvenient instead of a lifelong spiritual test. The likely tools and methods are not impossible to imagine in general terms. The workers may have used hard rubbing stones, sand, mineral abrasives, water, and a careful progression from rough grinding to finer polishing. They may have had specialised burnishers or polishing materials. They may have used techniques known from Mauryan stonework more broadly. None of that requires lost lasers, floating machines, or a secret guild of time-travelling decorators with excellent taste in minimalism. But saying abrasive polishing does not fully answer the practical question. It names the category of process. It does not give us the workshop detail. It does not tell us the exact materials, the order of operations, the number of workers, the time involved, or the standards they used to decide when the surface was finished. That is the difference between knowing what probably happened and understanding how it happened. We can say that the granite was cut, abraded, and polished. We can say Mauryan craftsmen were capable of high stone finishes. We can compare the cave surfaces with Ashokan pillars and other polished works of the period. But we do not possess a surviving instruction manual from the Barabar workshop. No ancient supervisor left a careful note saying, "First use this grit, then rub for this many days, then check the reflection of a lamp from 3 paces away, and if the Emperor is visiting, pretend everything is going according to schedule. We have the result, not the recipe." And the result is good enough to keep the recipe interesting. The polish also raises the question of scale. Polishing a small object is demanding, but the body can handle it directly. You hold the object or fix it in place. You change angle. You inspect it in daylight. Polishing a cave interior requires working across large areas in a confined space. The ceiling is overhead. The walls stretch beyond the reach of one person. The floor may be underfoot while dust and grit collect. Light must be brought in. The worker must judge the surface at close range and also understand how it behaves as a whole. A polished wall can look smooth in one patch and uneven when seen from an angle. Reflections reveal flaws that touch alone might miss. In a dark cave, that judgment becomes even more complicated. Light inside Barabar would have been an active tool as much as a source of visibility. A lamp flame could reveal changes in the surface. A bright reflection might show where a plane was smooth. A broken reflection might show unevenness. The workers may have used light deliberately, moving it along the wall to catch flaws. Anyone who has ever tried to clean a window, polish silver, or wipe a mirror knows this problem in a small domestic way. It looks fine until the light shifts, and suddenly there is a smear, a streak, a mark, or one mysterious fingerprint that clearly belongs to someone else, even if nobody else is home. Now imagine the same problem on granite, inside a cave, in the 3rd century BCE, with imperial expectations in the background. The polish at Barabar is often described as mirror-like, and that phrase is useful, though it should not make us imagine a modern bathroom mirror with perfect clarity. The stone does not become glass. It remains granite, dark, mineral, and ancient. The reflection is not clean in the way silvered glass is clean. It is more like a shadowed shine, a softened return of light and shape. In photographs, especially when taken at a shallow angle, the effect can look dramatic, almost impossible. In person, it would change with lighting, position, wear, and the particular surface. Still, the essential point remains. The walls were brought to a finish far beyond ordinary rough carving. They shine enough that the interior feels transformed. And this transformation changes the meaning of the cave. A rough cave absorbs attention differently. Its irregularities keep the eye busy. A polished cave simplifies. It removes texture. It creates broad, smooth planes that interact with light and sound. The room feels less like a natural hollow and more like an intentional container. The polish makes the darkness cleaner, the silence sharper, and the echo stronger. It also gives the walls a strange presence. A matte wall simply stands there. A polished wall responds. It receives light and sends it back. It gives the person inside a faint awareness of movement, even when the room is still. For an ascetic community, that may have mattered. A polished surface in a dark chamber is not decorative in the ordinary sense. It does not show a scene. It does not teach through images. It does not entertain. Instead, it changes the sensory conditions of the room. The person inside sees less detail, not more. The eye cannot wander through carvings. There is no crowded mythology on the wall, no painted procession, no garden pattern, no royal scene. There is granite, shine, darkness, and the body's own presence. If the Ajivikas used these spaces for retreat, meditation, shelter, or recitation, the Polish would have shaped the experience not by filling the mind with imagery, but by removing visual distraction while making the environment feel deliberately made. That restraint is easy to overlook because later Indian rock-cut architecture often becomes richly decorated. At Ajanta, Ellora, Kala and many other sites, caves expand into halls, monasteries, shrines, sculptural programs, painted surfaces, pillars, and elaborate religious storytelling. Those later places are extraordinary in a different way. Barabar stands earlier and plainer, but it is not less intentional. It belongs to a moment when rock-cut architecture had not yet become the grand visual theatre it would later become. Here the power lies in surface and form. The granite is not covered, it is perfected. This may also explain why the Polish feel so modern to many observers. Modern design often values smoothness, clean surfaces, minimal decoration, and precise finish. We are used to associating that look with machines, factories, contemporary materials, and expensive kitchens in which nobody seems to actually cook. When we see a 2,300-year-old granite chamber with smooth reflective walls and simple geometry, It clashes with our expectation of ancient roughness. The mind reaches for the wrong comparison. It says, this looks modern, so perhaps it required modern-like tools. But visual similarity does not prove technological similarity. Different methods can sometimes produce effects that feel surprisingly familiar. Ancient Polish can look modern because smoothness itself is timeless. A hard surface made flat and glossy will always look controlled. The more useful comparison is not with modern machines, but with other Mauryan works. Ashokan pillars are famous for their smooth, polished surfaces. These pillars show that high stone finishing was part of Mauryan technical culture. Barabar did not emerge from nowhere. It belongs to a broader world of imperial stonework in which Polish carried prestige, authority, and perhaps symbolic meaning. The pillars stood in public landscapes, bearing inscriptions and moral messages. Their Polish gave them visual power. They caught light. They looked refined, durable, and royal. In the caves, that same love of finish was turned inward. Instead of a polished object standing under the sun, the finish surrounded a person in darkness. That inward turn is one of the most fascinating parts of Barabar. Polishing the inside of a cave is not the most efficient way to impress a crowd. Many people can see a pillar at once. A cave chamber can only be experienced by those who enter. The Polish is therefore intimate. It is not hidden, but it is enclosed. It belongs to the user more than the passerby. That makes sense if the caves were meant for ascetics, but it also complicates the idea of royal display. The emperor's generosity is recorded by inscription, but the finest effect of the gift happens inside the stone, away from the open air. This is not only public propaganda, it is a carefully made environment. Could the Polish have had symbolic meaning? It is tempting to say yes, and perhaps it did. Smoothness could suggest purity, discipline, permanence, or the controlled mind. A reflective surface could invite self-awareness. The absence of decoration could support renunciation. But we should be careful. These meanings are plausible, not proven. The Ajivikas left us too little of their own voice to say exactly what they thought of such surfaces. A polished chamber may have been spiritually meaningful, practically useful, aesthetically valued, or simply the expected standard of a royal Mauryan stone gift. It may have been all of these at once. History rarely chooses only one reason when several will do. There is also the question of why the technique seems to become rare after the Mauryan period. Later, cave architecture in India reached enormous complexity and beauty, but the specific mirror-like polish of Barabar was not generally repeated in the same way. This has led to suggestions that the high polish was tied to Mauryan imperial resources, specialist workshops, or a technical tradition that did not continue widely. That does not mean the knowledge vanished overnight as if everyone woke up one morning and forgot how to rub stone. It may mean that the conditions changed. Imperial patronage shifted. Religious architecture developed different priorities. Donors may have preferred sculptural elaboration, larger halls, painted surfaces, or other forms of merit and display. A technique can be known and still not be used if it is too costly, too slow, or no longer fashionable. Anyone who owns a bread maker from the 1990s understands this principle on a smaller scale. The possible influence of wider stoneworking traditions also enters the discussion. Some scholars have connected Mauryan Polish with contacts between India and the Persian or Hellenistic worlds after the fall of the Achaemenid Empire, while others emphasize local developments and older Indian traditions of stone polishing. The truth may involve movement of techniques, adaptation, and local expertise rather than a single simple origin. Empires do not exist in sealed boxes. Artisans move, ideas move, materials teach people, courts borrow, adapt, and transform. What matters at Barabar is that by the 3rd century BCE, the Mauryan world had the ability and desire to produce highly polished stone surfaces at a remarkable level. Whether the technique was imported, developed locally, or shaped by multiple influences, the cave walls show its mastery. The walls also show how Polish can hide labour. A rough tool mark tells a story directly. You can see where the chisel struck. You can imagine the blow. A polished surface erases many of those clues. It is the result of work that removes the evidence of earlier work. That is part of its elegance and part of its mystery. The smoother the surface becomes, the less it explains itself. The cave begins to look as though it simply emerged that way, which is ridiculous and yet visually persuasive. The polish conceals the struggle that created it. This is why the walls feel almost too perfect. Not because they truly have no history, but because the final finish has wiped much of that history clean. Unfinished areas in some caves help balance that impression. Where the polish is absent or incomplete, the stone reminds us of process. There we can sense rougher stages, interrupted work, or surfaces that did not receive the final treatment. The contrast between finished and unfinished is valuable because it gives the polished walls context. It shows that the shine was not automatic. It was achieved. The unfinished spaces are like a backstage glimpse. They let us see that the polished chambers are not the natural condition of the granite. They are the result of additional labour and perhaps of selective importance. Not every surface was equally finished. Not every chamber reached the same state. The polish appears where effort was focused. What would it have felt like when newly completed? This question is worth lingering on because today's caves have weathered, aged, and been visited for centuries. But when fresh, the finish may have been even more striking. Imagine the first lamp carried inside after the final polishing. The flame enters the chamber and breaks across the walls. The granite does not glitter like gold or marble. It gleams darkly. It reflects in a subdued, almost private way. The worker who polished it may see the lamp move along the surface and know the job is done. An Ajivika ascetic entering later may see the same effect and feel the room change around him. A royal official may inspect the inscription and the finish together, making sure the emperor's gift has the proper dignity. The cave is new, but it already feels ancient because granite carries age in its very substance. The tactile experience matters too. A polished granite wall feels different from a rough one. It is cool, hard and smooth. The hand slides rather than catches. The body understands refinement through touch, even before the mind begins making theories. For an ascetic, touch may have been part of the environment in a practical way. Sitting near a smooth wall, leaning briefly against stone, walking barefoot or nearly barefoot on a prepared floor, hearing sound returned from hard surfaces. All of this would shape the daily use of the cave. Architecture is not only seen, it is felt by the skin, heard by the ear, measured by the body. There is a quiet irony here. The caves were made for people who likely rejected ordinary luxury, yet the finish is luxurious in effort. Not luxurious like silk, perfume, food or ornament. Luxurious in labour. The walls are austere, but the work behind them is extravagant. This creates a tension that lies at the heart of Barabar. Why would renunciants receive such refined spaces? Perhaps because the polish was not understood as luxury in that context. Perhaps it was royal quality, a sign of seriousness and permanence. Perhaps smoothness served practical purposes, easier cleaning, less dust, better acoustics, improved light reflection. Perhaps the finish marked the cave as a purified, controlled space, separated from the roughness of ordinary rock. Or perhaps, because Ashoka's court had mastered a prestigious stone finish, anything made under that authority was expected to carry it. Ancient people, like modern people, sometimes use the best available finish because that was what a powerful patron did. The polish also plays with time. Rough stone looks old in a straightforward way. Polished stone can look strangely new even when it is ancient. That is one reason Barabar unsettles the viewer. The surface refuses to age in the way we expect. It has marks, wear, and damage, of course. But its underlying finish still carries the confidence of the moment it was made. The caves seem to collapse distance. You know they belong to the 3rd century BCE, but the walls do not behave like a simple relic. They still shine, they still reflect, they still perform. The past does not feel buried, it feels present, standing very close, possibly closer than is comfortable if you were hoping for a simple bedtime story. And yet, the most honest answer to the question of the mirror polish is not that no one knows anything. We know quite a lot. We know the broader Mauryan context. We know that high polish appears on pillars and stonework from the period. We know granite can be polished with abrasives and time. We know imperial patronage could support demanding work. What we do not know is the exact practical chain that turned those Barabar walls from rough excavation into glossy stone. We do not know every tool, material, motion, worker, workshop tradition or decision. That is the gap. Not a gap large enough to require fantasy, but large enough to keep wonder alive. Sometimes that is the best kind of mystery. It does not ask us to abandon reason. It asks us to admit the limits of what has survived. The mirror polish of Barabar is not a magic trick. It is a historical achievement whose method is partly visible and partly missing. The visible part is the stone itself. The missing part is the human process in full detail. Between them lies the fascination. We stand in front of the wall or look at images of it, and we can say, people did this. Then, almost immediately we ask, exactly how did they do it so well? The first statement gives ancient workers their due. The second keeps us humble, and there is humility in polished stone. That may sound odd, because the surface itself feels so confident. But for us, looking back, the polish is a reminder that the past contains expertise we cannot always reconstruct easily. We are surrounded by modern technology, but that does not mean we understand every ancient technique better than the people who used it. They knew their materials through practice. They had time, patience, and skilled traditions that were not always written down. When those traditions fade, the finished objects can remain like locked doors. We can study the door, we can measure it, we can compare it with others, but the hand that made the key is gone. In Barabar, the polished walls are that locked door. They are not speaking in words, but they continue to give information. They tell us that the Mauryan period possessed remarkable stone finishing skill. They tell us that the caves were not merely functional shelters. They tell us that the inner experience of the chamber mattered. They tell us that hard granite was made to hold light in a controlled way. They tell us that a vanished religious community was given an environment of extraordinary refinement. They also tell us, by refusing to explain everything, that history is never complete. As the eye moves along the glossy surface, another feature begins to make itself known. Smooth granite does not only reflect light, it reflects sound. The same hard walls that send a flame's glow sliding back into the chamber can also send a voice returning through the air. A polished cave is not just something to look at, it is something that answers. And once the walls have been cut, shaped, and brought to that dark shine, the room begins to reveal its next strange quality. The way it can make a simple human sound swell, linger, and come back as if the granite itself has decided to join the conversation. Once the granite had been cut and polished, the caves gained a quality that no drawing can fully explain. They did not only become rooms, they became rooms that answered. A person could enter with a lamp, step away from the outside air, speak a few words and hear the stone return them. Not softly, not in the ordinary way a wall reflects a little sound, but with a force and clarity that makes the body notice before the mind has time to prepare a sensible explanation. In a place like Barabar, a whisper is not just a whisper. A cough becomes an event. A chant can stretch itself around the chamber and come back altered, fuller, stranger, as if the cave has briefly decided to participate. This is one of the most fascinating parts of the Barabar mystery, because sound is harder to preserve than stone. We can still see the walls, we can still study the inscriptions, we can still measure the chambers and examine the polish, but the ancient soundscape is gone in the most direct sense. We cannot hear exactly what an Ajivika ascetic heard more than 2,300 years ago, not with the same lamp, The same darkness, the same breathing, the same expectation, the same belief. Sound is temporary, it happens and vanishes, it leaves no fossil, no written record in the air. Yet architecture can remember sound in its own way. A chamber that echoed then will echo now, even if the voices have changed. The stone cannot tell us what was chanted, but it can still show us how chanting behaved. Anyone who has ever sung in a bathroom knows that hard surfaces can be very generous to the human voice. Tiles, glass and plaster do not absorb sound the way curtains, carpets and soft furniture do. They send it back. This is why an ordinary person can step into a tiled room and briefly sound as though they have been preparing for a concert tour, when in fact they are just trying to remember the second line of a song. Barabar works on the same basic principle, though in a far more ancient and atmospheric setting. The polished granite walls are hard and smooth, the chambers are enclosed, the ceilings are shaped. Sound waves travel out from the voice, strike the walls, and reflect. When many reflections return quickly, the room fills with reverberation. When certain surfaces send sound back more distinctly, an echo can stand out. The result is not only heard by the ear, it is felt by the body. In the Sudama cave, this effect must have been especially striking. The cave includes a rectangular hall and a rounded inner chamber, and the surfaces are highly polished. A rectangular space already allows sound to travel and return in noticeable ways, but a rounded or vaulted space changes the experience further. Curves can gather, redirect, and prolong sound. They can make a voice seem to come from more than one place. They can blur the boundary between the original sound and its return. In a modern concert hall, acoustics are carefully planned so that music reaches listeners with richness and clarity. In Barabar, whether by calculation, tradition, experiment, or discovery, the room created something powerful with very little inside it. No instruments were required. The cave itself became the resonant body. That phrase, resonant body, is worth holding gently. A musical instrument is not only the thing that produces sound, it is the thing that shapes sound. A violin string vibrates, but the wooden body gives the vibration volume and character. A drum head moves, but the hollow space below it deepens the beat. A flute turns breath into tone because air moves through a shaped tube. At Barabar, the human voice may have acted like the string, the drumhead or the breath, while the chamber shaped the result. A chant offered into the cave did not remain ordinary speech. It entered the geometry of the room and returned as something thickened by stone. Of course, we must be careful. It is easy to become carried away and imagine the caves as perfectly designed ancient sound machines, built with mathematical acoustic planning that we can state with complete confidence. The evidence does not allow that kind of certainty. We do not have an inscription saying, "This chamber was polished so that a low chant would reverberate beautifully at sunset. Please stand near the left wall for the best effect." Ancient builders, rather inconsiderately, did not always leave us helpful user manuals, but we can say something more cautious and still deeply interesting. The caves do produce notable echoes. Their hard polished surfaces help reflect sound. Their shapes affect how sound moves, and anyone using them for religious retreat would almost certainly have noticed this. That last point matters. Ancient people were not less sensitive to their surroundings. They did not need a modern acoustic report to know when a room sounded unusual. If anything, in a world without engines, loudspeakers, traffic, air conditioning, and the faint electronic hum that seems to follow modern life around like a tired mosquito, people may have noticed such effects more sharply. A single voice inside a polished granite cave would have been an event. A repeated syllable, a breath-based chant, a recitation, or even footsteps would carry significance. The cave did not need to be engineered with modern formulas to become meaningful through sound. It only needed to be experienced. And the Ajivikas, if they used these spaces for retreat, meditation, or religious discipline, would have been living in the cave rather than just visiting it with a camera and a schedule. This is important because acoustics change with use. A tourist steps in, says something, laughs at the echo and steps out again. An ascetic may sit there for hours. He may hear the first sound of dawn outside the entrance, the movement of rain, the scrape of a foot, the low repetition of a phrase, the echo of another person's voice, or the strange enlargement of his own. Over time, the chamber's sound would become part of its identity. The cave would not be a silent container. It would be a disciplined environment where sound could not easily escape without being transformed. There is also the question of darkness. Sound feels different when vision is reduced. In daylight, the eye dominates. We look, name, measure, compare, and orient ourselves. In a dark chamber, the ear becomes more important. The smallest noise gains detail. A drip, a breath, fabric moving, a hand touching stone, all become clearer. If a lamp were used, the room would not be fully dark, but it would still be dim by modern standards. The polished walls would catch moving light, but not necessarily reveal the whole space at once. In that half-seen environment, echo could feel more powerful because the source of returning sound might be visually uncertain. Your voice leaves your mouth, travels into darkness, and comes back from a wall you cannot clearly see. It is a simple physical effect, and yet the human mind is very good at turning simple physical effects into deep experiences, especially when sitting in a polished granite cave built by an emperor for a sect that believed the universe had already decided everything. The strength of the echo also depends on what the cave is missing. Soft materials absorb sound. Cloth, cushions, leaves, bodies, carpets, and rough porous surfaces all take some energy out of sound waves. Barabar's interiors are hard, bare, and polished. There is very little to soften the return. This bareness suits the ascetic character of the site. A decorated palace room might impress the eye, but absorbs sound through furnishings and human clutter. A bare granite chamber does the opposite. It removes comfort and gives back resonance. In that sense, the austerity of the cave may be one reason it sings. It is empty enough to answer. That emptiness can be misunderstood. Empty does not mean unused or meaningless. In religious spaces, emptiness can be highly intentional. It can create focus. It can remove distraction. It can make the body aware of its own presence. At Barabar, the lack of decoration does not make the caves dull. It makes them intense. There is nowhere for the gaze to wander except along polished stone. There is little for the ear to hear except what the chamber returns. A person inside becomes part of the room's activity. The cave is plain until someone breathes, speaks, chants, or moves. Then it reveals itself. The word singing is not meant to suggest that the caves produce music on their own, like a choir of extremely patient rocks waiting for the right audience. They do not hum independently in the dark, at least not in any way that would be helpful during a site inspection. But they do make sound behave musically. They prolong it. They thicken it. They give tones a kind of body. A single syllable may bloom and fade. A chant may gain layers. The voice can seem to belong partly to the speaker and partly to the space. For religious practice, that could be powerful. Many traditions use repeated sound because repetition changes attention. A syllable spoken once is a sound. A syllable repeated steadily becomes rhythm, breath, focus, and sometimes prayer. Put that repetition in an echoing chamber and it becomes spatial. The sound surrounds the person making it. This raises the possibility that the acoustics were part of the cave's purpose, not merely an accidental feature. But again, the safest word is possibility. The builders may have known from experience that polished hard chambers echoed well. They may have shaped the rooms partly for that reason. Or they may have prioritized polish, durability, and architectural form with the acoustic effect emerging naturally. Once discovered, the effect would likely have become part of how the caves were used. Intention can enter a building at more than one stage. A feature can be designed from the beginning, or it can be noticed and then valued. Ancient architecture often grows from both planning and experience. If the Ajivikas engaged in chant or recitation, The caves could have amplified the seriousness of that practice. If they sought silence, the echo could have made silence more noticeable by contrast. That sounds contradictory at first, but it is not. A room that strongly returns sound also teaches you the weight of making sound. In an ordinary outdoor setting, a small noise disappears into air. In Barabar, a small noise may come back. The chamber makes you aware of disturbance. It encourages stillness by making movement audible. Anyone who has tried to be quiet in a room with a creaky floorboard understands this effect very well. The room becomes a teacher, though not always a patient one. The polished walls would also affect how groups use the space. A few people chanting together inside such a chamber might hear their voices merge in ways that made individual sound less distinct. The room could blur the line between one voice and many, between the spoken phrase and its return. This might create a sense of fullness in a space that was physically small. A chamber does not need to hold a large crowd to feel immense if sound continues after the voice stops. Reverberation stretches the moment. It makes time feel slightly wider. In a sleep story, that might sound soothing. In a dark granite room, it might sound profound, eerie, or both. There is an interesting comparison with later religious architecture, though we should not push it too far. Many sacred buildings around the world use acoustics, whether intentionally designed or naturally discovered. Cathedrals make choirs soar. Buddhist caves and halls can carry chant. Mosques shape the spoken word. Temples, tombs, and chambers often produce echoes that become part of their atmosphere. Sound matters because religion is not only seen, it is heard. Sacred words are recited, prayers are spoken, bells ring, drums beat. Silence itself is shaped by surrounding noise. The Barabar Caves belong to a much earlier and simpler architectural form, but they already show how a built or carved environment can change the voice. The simplicity of the chambers makes the sound even more central. Later caves may contain pillars, sculptures, shrines, and paintings, all of which divide attention. At Barabar, the interior is restrained. The room does not tell stories through images. It lets the body discover its own presence through sound and surface. This may be why visitors find the echo so memorable. It is not one feature among many. It is one of the main things the cave does. The walls shine, the voice returns, the darkness holds both. And because the cave was cut from granite, the echo carries a special kind of authority. Sound returning from wood feels warm. Sound returning from plaster feels familiar. Sound returning from stone feels old, even when the sound itself is new. There is a firmness to it. The echo comes back from something that seems permanent. This can create the impression that the cave is speaking, though of course it is only reflecting. But human beings are always tempted to treat reflection as response. We do it with mirrors, with water, with mountains, with empty rooms, with the moon, and occasionally with pets who are simply trying to sleep. When a cave returns your voice, it is hard not to feel addressed. This feeling may explain why the Barabar Caves have had a long afterlife in imagination. Even people who have never visited them can be struck by descriptions of their acoustics. A polished stone chamber that sings is a powerful image. It suggests hidden knowledge, ritual, and a meeting between material and mind. In E. M. Forster's novel A Passage to India, the fictional Barabar Caves, inspired by Barabar, become places of unsettling echo, where sound loses ordinary meaning and returns as something blank and disturbing. Forster's literary caves are not archaeological descriptions, but they show how strongly the idea of such a place can work on the imagination. An echoing cave is never only a physical space in a story, it becomes a psychological one. At the real Barabar, though, the physical facts are already enough. We do not need to turn the caves into symbols before they are interesting. Their acoustics arise from actual material conditions: granite, polish, shape, enclosure, and emptiness. The mystery is not whether sound reflects in hard chambers. That part is clear. The mystery is how much the builders intended, how much the users valued, and how the sound shaped the spiritual life that once occurred there. The cave gives us the effect but not the explanation. It lets us hear the answer without hearing the question. There is also a practical side to sound in caves. Echo can help or hinder communication. In a highly reverberant chamber, speech may become harder to understand if too many words are spoken quickly. A slow chant may work beautifully because each sound has time to bloom and fade. This might encourage a slower vocal practice. Fast conversation could become muddled. Silence and measured syllables would suit the space better. That is an interesting possibility because the architecture may have shaped behaviour simply through acoustic feedback. The cave rewards certain sounds and punishes others. Speak too quickly, and the room becomes confused. Chant slowly, and the room becomes rich. In this way, stone can train the voice. The same effect might influence the body. A strong echo makes a person aware of breath and timing. If a sound returns after a brief delay, the speaker may adjust pace unconsciously. The room becomes a partner in rhythm. For meditation or recitation, this could deepen concentration. For ordinary chatter, it might be annoying after about 30 seconds, which is perhaps why the caves were better suited to ascetics than to family holidays. Imagine trying to settle a minor argument inside a chamber, where every sentence comes back with added drama. It would be very difficult to remain casual. The echo also invites us to think about the relationship between precision and experience. The smoothness of the walls discussed earlier is not merely visual. It helps create the acoustic environment. Rough surfaces scatter sound. Smooth surfaces reflect it more cleanly. Curved and vaulted forms alter the direction and duration of reflections. The cutting, polishing, and acoustic effects are therefore not separate mysteries. They are linked. The same workmanship that makes the walls gleam also helps the voice linger. The same granite that resists tools also preserves resonance. The same empty austerity that reflects religious discipline also allows sound to fill the chamber. Barabar is a place where material, technique, and use come together. And this is where the caves begin to feel less like unfinished questions and more like carefully arranged conditions. The builders may not have thought in modern, technical language. They may not have spoken of acoustic reflection coefficients or reverberation time, but they could hear, they could compare, they could notice that one shape sounded different from another. They could understand from practice that polished hard stone produced a powerful effect. Ancient knowledge often works through doing before it works through theory. A builder does not need equations to know that a room sounds wrong. A singer does not need a physics degree to know where the voice feels supported. Knowledge can live in the ear, the hand, and the memory. That possibility should make us cautious about underestimating the builders. We sometimes imagine ancient design as either primitive guesswork or impossible lost science, with nothing in between. The truth is usually richer. Skilled people can achieve refined results through observation, tradition, experiment, and repeated adjustment. If Mauryan stoneworkers had experience with polished surfaces, if religious users valued chant or silence, and if patrons wanted durable, refined spaces, then the acoustic power of the caves may have emerged through a combination of skill and attention rather than through mystery alone. The result is still remarkable. It just becomes human remarkable, which is the best kind. Inside one of these chambers, the experience would have unfolded slowly. The first step in from daylight, the dimness, the smell of stone, perhaps dust, perhaps dampness in the season of the rain, the lamp moving across the wall, the hand reaching out and feeling a cold, smooth surface. Then the first sound, maybe a spoken word, maybe a chant, maybe just the scrape of a foot. The chamber returns it. The person stops. The silence after the echo feels different from the silence before. Now the room has shown what it can do. Every later sound is made with that knowledge. This may have been part of the spiritual force of the place. Not because the cave contains anything supernatural, but because it changes ordinary perception. It makes the voice unfamiliar. It turns a simple sound into something larger. It slows attention. it makes silence noticeable. For ascetics trying to step away from everyday life, that kind of sensory shift could matter deeply. The cave does not preach a doctrine, it creates a condition. It makes the world smaller, darker, smoother, and more resonant, and then leaves the mind to meet itself there. There is a beautiful restraint in that. The chambers do not explain themselves. They do not tell us what the Ajivikas believed in enough detail to satisfy modern curiosity. They do not preserve the songs or recitations that may once have moved through them. They do not tell us whether the echo was planned, discovered, celebrated, feared, or simply accepted as part of the environment. They only continue to work, speak, and the room responds. And the sound thickens. Stand quietly, and the silence feels shaped. After more than 2,000 years, the caves still perform the same basic act. They receive sound and return it. This is why the phrase singing chambers feels appropriate, even if we use it gently. The caves are not songs, but they make singing different. They are not voices, but they change the voice. They are not instruments in the usual sense, but they have the essential quality of instruments. They transform vibration into experience. In a world where the Ajivikas believed life moved according to a vast order, perhaps such a chamber would have felt like a small model of that order. Hard, enclosing, responsive, indifferent, and yet strangely exact. A sound enters, follows the rules of the space and returns as it must. Even the echo obeys destiny. And after listening to the chambers, after imagining how their smooth walls returned voice and breath, we can begin to look more closely at the individual spaces themselves. Because Barabar is not one cave with one effect, but a group of related chambers, each with its own shape, entrance, finish, and atmosphere. Some are famous for their facades, some for their inscriptions, some for their polish, some for what they left unfinished. To understand why these caves still feel so precise and so strange, we have to move from the general sound of the stone into the particular rooms where that sound lived. The elegant doorway of Lomas Rishi, the polished severity of Sudama, and the other carefully cut spaces that turn the granite hills into one of the most unusual architectural beginnings in India. After the echo, the individual caves begin to feel less like a group of archaeological features and more like separate rooms in a very old conversation. They belong to the same granite hills, they share the same Mauryan atmosphere, and they are often discussed together, but each one has its own character. Some invite attention through their entrance, some through their polish, some through their plan, some through the strange fact that they were begun with such ambition and then not finished in quite the way the others were. The Barabar Caves are not a single repeated design stamped into the hillside like copies from an ancient office printer, though one imagines the Mauryan administration would have been rather pleased with such efficiency. They are related spaces, shaped by a common technical world, but each has its own way of handling stone, darkness, sound, and approach. Lomas Rishi is the one many people remember first, because it has the face that looks back at you. Its entrance is one of the most famous early images in Indian rock-cut architecture. A carefully carved arch set into the granite, with a curved form that resembles the shape later known in Indian architecture as the Chaitya arch. Along the curve, elephants move in a line towards sacred symbols, giving the doorway a sense of procession. It is not a large scene, not a crowded wall of mythology, not a palace facade covered with ornament, but it is enough. It tells the visitor that this opening is not just a hole in the rock. It has been marked, framed, and given meaning. The entrance of Lomas Rishi is important because it seems to preserve in stone an older memory of wooden architecture. Ancient buildings in India were often made of timber, thatch, bamboo, and other organic materials that do not survive kindly in the archaeological record. Wood can be worked beautifully, but it does not always have the patience of granite. It burns, rots, breaks, and disappears, leaving later historians peering at stone copies and trying to reconstruct the missing originals, like people trying to understand a vanished song from the shape of the instrument case. At Lomas Rishi, the carved arch seems to imitate a form that may once have belonged to wooden or thatched structures. Stone is acting like memory. It is not just making something new, it is preserving the shape of something older and more fragile. That alone would make Lomas Rishi significant, but the cave is also fascinating because of what lies beyond the entrance, and because it was not completed to the same polished level as some of its neighbours. The interior follows a general plan similar to Sudama, with an outer rectangular space and an inner rounded chamber approached through a smaller passage. But unlike the more fully finished caves, Lomas Rishi appears unfinished inside. This unfinished quality is not a disappointment. It is one of the most useful things about it. It lets us glimpse the difference between intention and completion, between the idea of the cave and the full labour required to bring it into final form. A finished surface can hide process. An unfinished one lets the process breathe through. Standing before Lomas Rishi in the mind, the contrast is striking. Outside, the entrance carries ornament and visual identity. It speaks with a shaped arch and carved elephants. Inside, the work becomes quieter, plainer, and partly incomplete. The facade looks forward into centuries of Indian rock-cut architecture, influencing the visual language of later Buddhist cave entrances and Chaitya halls. But the interior looks backward toward the actual difficulty of making such a place. It reminds us that these caves were not effortless expressions of a fully settled tradition. They were early, experimental, ambitious, and sometimes interrupted. Lomas Rishi is both a beginning and a question. Why was it left unfinished? The usual explanation points to structural problems, including cracks or flaws in the rock that may have made continued work unsafe or impractical. That is a sensible explanation, and it brings us back to the reality of granite. However confident the builders were, they still had to negotiate with the hill. A rock-cut cave is not made from a perfect block delivered by request. It is made from stone as nature left it, with hidden fractures, variations, weaknesses, and surprises. A plan can be beautiful, but the hill may have other ideas. If the stone begins to fail or reveal danger, the work must adapt or stop. Even imperial ambition has to be careful when the ceiling is made of the same material that is currently threatening to become the floor. That unfinished state also helps correct a common misunderstanding. When people see the most polished Barabar interiors, they can imagine that everything was achieved with mysterious ease, as if the builders possessed a smooth technology that simply passed over granite and left it shining. Lomas Rishi argues against that. It shows difficulty, it shows incompletion, it shows the limits imposed by material conditions. The ancient builders were skilled, but not magical. They could accomplish extraordinary things, but they still worked with rock, risk, and time. That makes the finished caves more impressive, not less. They were completed not because granite was easy, but because the workers managed the difficulty well enough to reach the final surface. Beside Lomas Rishi, Sudama offers a different kind of power. If Lomas Rishi is remembered for its entrance, Sudama is remembered for its interior. It is one of the clearest examples of the Barabar experience. An outer rectangular chamber leading into an inner rounded room, both shaped from granite, both associated with the Mauryan period, and the surfaces polished to the famous dark shine. Sudama feels less like a facade and more like an environment. It does not rely on carved narrative. It does not overwhelm with size. Its strength is in the way the body moves from one chamber to another, from daylight to darkness, from a more open rectangular hall into a rounded interior that changes the feel of sound and space. The layout matters because it creates sequence. You do not simply enter a single empty room, you pass inward. The rectangular outer hall receives you first. It is plain, controlled, polished, and echoing. Then the inner rounded chamber draws the attention further. A narrow passage connects the spaces, making the movement feel deliberate. Even without decoration, the plan creates drama. Not loud drama, not the sort with trumpets and everyone pretending not to look at the king, but a slow architectural drama. You go from outside to inside, from light to dimness, from one shape to another. The cave organises experience by changing geometry. The rounded inner chamber is especially important because roundness changes how a person feels in a room. Rectangular rooms are familiar. We live in them, work in them, store things in them, and occasionally lose our keys in them despite their completely reasonable geometry. A rounded stone chamber feels different. There are fewer corners for the eye to rest on. The ceiling and walls seem to relate more continuously. Sound moves in a less ordinary way. The body senses enclosure more strongly. In Sudama, this rounded space inside a granite hill must have had a concentrated atmosphere. It was not large, but size is not the only measure of intensity. A small room can feel vast if it changes how sound, light, and attention behave. This is where the phrase impossible calm begins to make sense. Not impossible because the room could not have been made, but because the calm it creates is so hard won. The surface appears still, but it is the result of thousands upon thousands of actions. The room feels quiet, but it was born from striking, grinding, and polishing. The chamber seems simple, but its simplicity required planning, labour, and restraint. There is no clutter, no visual noise, no unnecessary flourish inside Sudama. The architecture has been reduced to shape and surface. It is calm not because nothing happened there, but because so much effort has been absorbed into the final stillness. That calm would not necessarily have been soft. We should not imagine it as the cosy calm of a lamplit room with cushions, warm blankets, and a generous plate of biscuits, although that would admittedly improve most archaeological visits. The calm of Sudama is severe. It is cool stone, hard surfaces, echo, darkness, and controlled form. It is a place where comfort has been replaced by focus. For ascetics, this may have been exactly the point. The room does not entertain the senses. It sharpens them. It makes sound noticeable. It makes movement noticeable. It gives the mind very little external decoration to cling to. That kind of calm can be demanding. It asks something from the person inside. The polish deepens this feeling. A rough stone chamber would feel more natural, perhaps more cave-like in the ordinary sense. Sudama's polished walls feel intentionally withdrawn from rough nature. They are not natural surfaces. They are corrected surfaces. They show the hill disciplined by human hands. This combination of natural mass and human refinement is one of the great strengths of Barabar. The cave is inside a hill, but the interior is not wild. It is controlled. The visitor stands inside geology that has been turned into architecture, and the mind has to hold both truths at once. The inscription associated with Sudama makes the space even more grounded in history. It connects the cave to Ashoka's reign and its dedication to the Ajivikas. That means the calm inside the chamber was not only aesthetic, it was tied to patronage and religious use. A royal inscription does not tell us how every person used the cave, but it places the room within a clear act of giving. The cave was made for a community. It had a named function in the Mauryan religious world. That may be one reason its plainness feels so deliberate. It was not unfinished emptiness, it was a finished austerity. Karna Chowpar, sometimes spelled Karan Chowpar, adds another variation. It is a single rectangular chamber, long, polished and vaulted, with an inscription from Ashoka's period. It lacks the two-part sequence of Sudama and the famous carved facade of Lomas Rishi. Yet its simplicity is powerful in a different way. A single chamber can feel more direct. There is no inner room to move toward. The cave receives the visitor in one continuous space. The vaulted roof gives it form, the polish gives it shine, and the bare interior makes every sound count. It may have served as a rainy season shelter for Ajivikas. which brings an almost practical tenderness into the story. For all the mystery and imperial grandeur, people also needed protection from the monsoon. The rainy season is worth remembering. Ancient religious life was shaped by climate as much as philosophy. Ascetics who wandered during dry months often stayed in one place during the rains. This was partly practical, because travel became difficult, and partly ethical in traditions that wished to avoid harming the many small living things that appeared during the wet season. A cave offered shelter from rain, wind, heat, and insects, though one suspects insects were still capable of getting involved if sufficiently motivated. Karna Chowpar, as a rain retreat, reminds us that these spaces were not only symbolic, they were used by bodies in weather. They were part of seasonal life. Even so, the level of finish in such a space remains striking. If the goal were only to provide shelter from rain, a less refined chamber would have worked. The polish suggests that practical use and royal quality were combined. A place can be functional and also carry prestige. A cave can protect from weather and also express imperial support. A chamber can serve ascetics and still be made with extraordinary care. History often becomes more interesting when we stop forcing one purpose to cancel another. Visvakarma, also known as Visvajopri, or by related names in different accounts, complicates the group further. It is reached by steps cut into the rock and includes spaces that are not fully finished in the same way as the most polished interiors. Its plan, incomplete elements, and position remind us again that Barabar was not just a set of finished monuments, but a working landscape of excavation, design, and adaptation. Some parts show the intended language of the group, others show interruption. This mixture is valuable because it keeps the site human. Perfection alone can become almost sterile. Variation, incompletion, and difference help us see the makers behind the monument. Together, these caves show several different ways of making calm from stone. Lomas Rishi uses a marked entrance, architectural memory, and a powerful unfinished interior. Sudama uses sequence, polish, and rounded enclosure. Karna Chopar uses directness, simplicity, and a single resonant hall. Visvakarma shows process and partial completion. None of them needs elaborate decoration to matter. Their architecture is not primarily about filling surfaces with images. It is about shaping the conditions of experience, how one enters, how light behaves, how sound returns, how the body feels enclosed, how the mind responds to bare polished stone. This is why Barabar can feel so different from later cave complexes. Later Indian rock-cut sites often create entire worlds inside stone. Pillared halls, shrines, sculptural programs, painted stories, complex facades, monasteries with cells and spaces for large communities. Barabar is earlier and more restrained. It has not yet become a full narrative environment. It is closer to the beginning of the rock-cut tradition, and perhaps because of that, it feels unusually concentrated. The caves do not show us everything stone architecture would later become. They show an early moment when the essential questions were already present. How to enter the rock, how to shape the chamber, how to create sacred space, how to make the hard interior feel intentional. The architecture of Impossible Calm also comes from proportion. The caves are not enormous, but they are carefully formed. A small chamber can feel oppressive if poorly shaped, awkward if uneven, or ordinary if it lacks finish. At Barabar, the proportions, polish and acoustics work together. The rooms feel controlled. They have enough plainness to allow stillness, enough finish to feel special, and enough echo to prevent the stillness from feeling dead. The calm is not empty, it is responsive. The cave waits, but it also answers. Lomas Rishi's facade deserves a little more attention, because it became so influential as an architectural idea. The Chaitya arch, with its curved form, later appears across Indian rock-cut and temple architecture. At Barabar, we see an early stone version of that motif. This matters because architecture often carries ideas forward through shapes. A doorway form can outlive the materials that first created it. A curve first made in timber can become stone, then sculpture, then symbol. People may forget the original hut, hall, or wooden structure, but the form remains, moving from one context to another. Lomas Rishi stands at an early point in that long movement. The elephants carved along the arch also deserve to be seen not as decoration for decoration's sake, but as motion. They create a procession at the threshold. The visitor approaches a cave for ascetics, and the entrance itself shows figures moving towards sacred forms. It is a modest scene, but it turns the doorway into a transition. Outside, the world is open. At the threshold, stone animals move in order. Inside, the chamber waits in darkness. The facade marks the movement from ordinary space into a controlled religious interior. The fact that the inside remained unfinished makes the contrast more poignant. The doorway points toward a fully realized sacred space that the rock itself may have prevented from becoming complete. Sudama, by contrast, does not need such a facade to create its strongest effect. Its power is internal. The rectangular hall and rounded chamber make the cave feel like a sequence of inward movement. The polished surfaces carry light, the hard stone carries sound, and the inner chamber changes the sense of enclosure. It is easy to imagine an Ajivika ascetic entering not as a visitor admiring architecture, but as someone returning to a known place of retreat. The cave's calm would become familiar over time. Its echo would become expected. Its darkness would become part of practice. What startles the modern visitor may have steadied the ancient user. That difference between visitor and user is important. We often encounter ancient sites through short visits, photographs, descriptions, and the desire to understand quickly. The people for whom these spaces were made may have known them slowly. They may have sat through long hours, rain outside, heat fading from the stone, voices coming and going, lamps burning low. The architecture would not reveal itself all at once. It would become known through repetition. A rough patch here, a sound that returns there, a place where the lamp catches the wall, a moment when silence feels deeper because the last echo has just faded. Ancient architecture was often experienced over time, not consumed in a single glance. This slow experience may be one reason the caves still feel so compelling despite their plainness. They are not designed for quick visual satisfaction. They ask for attention. In a world of fast images that can feel almost strange, the caves do not perform loudly. They do not entertain. They do not explain themselves. They simply hold their conditions: stone, polish, form, sound, inscription, darkness. The viewer has to slow down enough to notice that this apparent simplicity is actually full of decisions. There is also a subtle relationship between the caves and the body's posture. A person entering a low, dark, echoing chamber may naturally move carefully. The footstep slows, the voice lowers, the head turns towards sound. The hand may reach for the wall. In this way, architecture shapes behaviour before thought does. The caves do not need written instructions saying, "Please be quiet and attentive." The space itself encourages it. This is one mark of effective architecture. It does not merely contain activity, it changes it. For the Ajivikas, whose exact practices are now mostly lost, such spaces may have provided a strong physical frame for discipline. If their worldview emphasized fate, cosmic order, and the unfolding of life according to forces beyond ordinary control, then the cave's severity may have suited them well. A polished granite chamber does not offer softness or distraction. It offers a stable, indifferent environment. It does not adjust to the mood of the person inside. It simply remains. That quality may have been valuable for people seeking to step outside ordinary social life. The cave is not comforting in a sentimental way. It is dependable. Dependability matters in ascetic life. A wandering person has few possessions and few fixed places. A cave donated by a king becomes a rare fixed point. The Barabar chambers may have served as seasonal shelters, retreat spaces, and symbols of recognition. Their architecture gave physical form to a relationship between empire and renunciation. Lomas Rishi, Sudama, Karna Chowpar, and Visvakarma each show that relationship differently. The Emperor's world had resources, inscriptions, planning, and stoneworkers. The Ajivika world valued withdrawal, discipline, and perhaps silence. The caves are where those worlds met, and that meeting is what gives the architecture its unusual calm. It is not the calm of nature left alone. It is not the calm of a palace built for ease. It is not even the calm of ruins after abandonment, though the caves have certainly gained that over centuries. It is a constructed calm, made by cutting, polishing, shaping, and withholding decoration. It was calm made with force, a quiet place produced through enormous noise, a plain room produced through imperial effort, a retreat for renunciants produced by a court that could command labour. Every part of that contradiction remains in the stone. So when we think of Lomas Rishi and Sudama together, we are really thinking of two sides of Barabar's importance. Lomas Rishi shows the doorway, the architectural memory, the visible beginning of a form that would echo through later Indian architecture. Sudama shows the chamber, the polished interior, the fully concentrated experience of stone and sound. One looks outward and forward, the other draws inward and deepens. Between them, the Barabar Hills become more than a set of early caves. They become a workshop of architectural ideas, how to frame an entrance, how to cut a sacred interior, how to use finish instead of ornament, how to make emptiness feel deliberate. The more closely we look, the less simple the caves become. Their calm is not blank, their plainness is not lack, their darkness is not merely the absence of light. Every surface and opening suggests decisions made under difficult conditions. Every finished wall implies many unfinished stages. Every echo depends on hard polish and chosen form. Every doorway ties the hill to a human purpose. And once these rooms are understood as individual works rather than a single mystery, the next question becomes unavoidable. What tools, techniques, and working methods allowed such rooms to come into being? And why do the explanations still leave so many people standing before the stone, quietly unconvinced that the ordinary words are quite enough? Once we have stood inside the polished silence of Lomas Rishi and Sudama, the practical question returns with all the patience of a mosquito in a dark room. How did they do it? Not in the broad, easy way where we say with tools, labour and time, and then quickly move on before the granite starts asking follow-up questions. But how exactly? What tools struck the stone? What kind of abrasive smoothed it? How were the lines set out? How did workers judge the surfaces inside a darkening cave? How many people were involved? How long did it take? What knowledge was already present in the Mauryan world, and what techniques may have been borrowed, adapted, improved, or lost? These questions are why the Barabar Caves continue to unsettle the imagination. The caves do not simply show that ancient builders worked hard. They show that ancient builders worked hard with a level of control that still feels difficult to explain in satisfying detail. The first thing to say, gently but clearly, is that the caves do not require us to imagine impossible technology. That may sound less thrilling at first than a theory involving vanished machines, secret energy beams, or a highly motivated team of ancient engineers with access to suspiciously modern equipment. But in truth, the human explanation is far more interesting. If we say the caves were made by something beyond human ability, we remove the very people whose skill deserves our attention. The real mystery is not whether humans could have made them. Humans did make them. The real mystery is how a specific community of builders, working more than 2,300 years ago, under Mauryan patronage, with the tools and knowledge available to them, achieved this particular combination of hard stone excavation, clean geometry, high polish, and acoustic effect. Granite forces the question because it resists simple answers. If these caves had been cut into soft sandstone, the achievement would still matter, but it would not have the same sharp edge. Granite is hard enough to make every theory earn its keep. A tool that works well on softer stone may be slow, blunted or broken against granite. A casual chisel mark becomes difficult. A smooth curve becomes an ordeal. A mirror polish becomes a long campaign. The stone itself is part of the evidence. It tells us that whatever method was used, it required persistence, abrasion, tool maintenance, and a practical understanding of how granite fractures and wears. The basic method probably began with impact. To create the rough chamber, workers would have needed to remove large amounts of stone. This could involve hammering, pecking, chiselling, and striking with tools made from iron or harder stone. Iron tools were known in the Mauryan period, and they would have been important for shaping hard materials, although iron alone does not magically solve granite. A chisel is only as good as the edge it can keep, the force behind it, and the knowledge of the person using it. Against granite, tools wear down. They need sharpening. They may bend, break, or become useless. This means the cave was not only a stone-cutting project, but also a tool-making and tool maintenance project. Somewhere behind the finished chamber there were smiths, supplies, and a steady rhythm of repair. That hidden support system matters. Ancient monuments are often admired as if they emerged directly from the hands of the workers at the site. But every large project depends on networks. Someone made the tools. Someone obtained the iron. Someone prepared handles. Someone carried water. Someone cleared debris. Someone brought food. Someone supervised alignment. Someone decided when a surface was not yet good enough, which may have made them very unpopular but historically useful. The caves are the visible outcome of invisible organisation. Ashoka's empire could provide that organisation in a way a small isolated group could not. Imperial patronage did not carve the stone by itself, but it created the conditions under which skilled carving could continue long enough to become extraordinary. The rough cutting would have been the most dramatic stage. Imagine the cave at its beginning, when the entrance was only a marked section of rock. Workers strike the granite. Chips fall. The opening slowly deepens. The first hollow is not a room yet, only a wound in the hill. Dust gathers. The sound is repetitive and hard. Stone does not move in generous pieces unless it is fractured properly. Too much force in the wrong place can damage the surface that must remain. Too little force wastes time. The workers needed to understand the difference between removing material and ruining the chamber. A cave is made by stopping at the right moment, again and again. This is especially important with rock-cut architecture because the final wall is not assembled. It is preserved. The worker removes the stone beside it and in front of it, but the surface that remains must become the wall. In a freestanding building, a bad block can sometimes be replaced. In a cave, a bad cut is part of the hill forever. That is why the Barabar interiors are so impressive. The workers were not simply hacking into granite and hoping for the best. They were producing planned rooms through subtraction. They had to keep track of depth, angle, ceiling curve, wall plane, doorway, inner chamber, and transitions between spaces while standing inside the object they were making. How did they measure? We do not know the full system, but we can imagine practical methods. Lines could be marked with cords, pigments, scratched guides, plumb bobs, measuring rods, and repeated checking by eye and touch. Ancient builders in many cultures used simple tools with great sophistication. A stretched cord can establish straightness. A plumb line can reveal verticality. A level can be approximated with water. A template can guide curves. Repetition can create consistency. The absence of laser levels does not mean the absence of precision. It means precision came through slower methods, skilled observation and correction over time. Anyone who has ever tried to hang a shelf and failed even with modern tools may pause here in quiet respect. The vaulted ceilings raise another practical question. How did workers shape a smooth curve overhead without overcutting or leaving awkward bumps? Templates may have helped. A curved guide could be used to compare the ceiling as it developed. Workers could check the symmetry of the curve from multiple points. They could remove high spots gradually. The process would be slow because the ceiling is unforgiving. A flat wall can be corrected by rubbing down raised areas, but a curved ceiling has to maintain its form across the whole surface. In low light, with dust, heat, and cramped conditions, this required a mental picture of the final geometry and the discipline to reach it in stages. Then came smoothing. After rough cutting, the stone would still hold tool marks, pits, and irregularities. The workers had to reduce these. They could use hammerstones, rubbing stones, and abrasive materials. Sand, quartz-rich grit, mineral powders, and other hard abrasives may have played a role. The idea is simple. A harder or similarly hard abrasive is rubbed against the surface, gradually wearing it down. Simple, however, does not mean easy. Polishing granite by hand over a large interior is slow, repetitive, and physically exhausting. The work moves from strength to endurance. It is no longer about breaking the stone open. It is about wearing it into obedience. This is where some theories focus on burnishing. Burnishing involves rubbing a surface with a hard, smooth tool, such as stone, to compact or smooth the surface and increase shine. In discussions of Mauryan polish, scholars and writers have suggested the possible use of agate or other hard stones as burnishers. Whether every detail of that suggestion applies to Barabar's granite interiors remains open, but the principle helps us understand the kind of work involved. Abrasion reduces roughness. Burnishing can refine the surface further. Repeated steps produce a finish that reflects light. The shine is not painted on. It is made by changing the surface itself. Yet this explanation leaves many people unsatisfied, and not entirely without reason. Saying abrasives and burnishing is accurate as a general pathway, but it is still vague. It does not tell us which abrasive was used first, which came second, how fine the final material was, whether water or oil was involved, how the workers reached the ceiling, how long each square section took, or how the final finish was inspected. The modern eye wants a complete reconstruction. The caves give us a result and a few clues. Between them lies a missing workshop tradition. This missing tradition is one reason Barabar attracts bold theories. Some people see the shine and think of machines. Others see the smoothness and imagine advanced lost tools. Some compare the interiors to modern polished stone and assume similar technology must have been required. It is an understandable reaction, but it is not a strong conclusion. Modern methods are not the only way to produce smoothness. A powered grinder does quickly what human labour can sometimes do slowly. The difference is time, organisation, and cost. Ancient societies could spend immense labour on projects that seem unreasonable to modern budgets, especially when religion and royal authority were involved. The pyramids, Roman roads, Chinese bronzes, Greek temples, Maya observatories, and Indian rock-cut halls all remind us that human beings can be very persistent when meaning, power, and skilled labour come together. A more grounded theory places Barabar within Mauryan stoneworking as a whole. Ashokan pillars, with their famous polish, show that the Mauryan court had access to highly skilled stone finishers. These pillars were not cave interiors, but they proved that high polish was part of the technical vocabulary of the period. If artisans could polish large stone pillars to a remarkable finish, then the Barabar Caves may represent the same expertise applied to the inside of a hill. That does not make the caves ordinary. It gives them a technical family. They are not isolated miracles. They are part of a broader moment when Mauryan craftsmanship in stone reached an unusually high standard. Some explanations also point outward, toward possible influence from Achaemenid Persian stoneworking traditions, or from wider contacts after Alexander's campaigns and the shifting political world of the northwest. The Mauryan Empire did not exist in total isolation. Ideas, artisans, diplomatic contacts and techniques could move across regions. Highly finished stonework was known in imperial Persian contexts, and some scholars have seen connections between Mauryan Polish and foreign stone finishing traditions. Others emphasize local roots, pointing to earlier Indian experience with polished stone tools, beads, and hard materials. The safer answer may be that technical traditions rarely have only one source. Local knowledge, imported ideas, court patronage, experimentation, and the stubborn education provided by the material itself may all have played a part. This is often how technology really develops, not as a sudden thunderbolt from nowhere, and not as a single borrowed trick neatly carried from one empire to another, but as a mixture of old skills applied to new ambitions. A worker who knows how to polish a smaller stone object may contribute to the polishing of larger surfaces. A court that admires foreign stonework may commission local versions. A ruler who wants durable inscriptions and gifts may support specialists. A workshop that masters one material may adapt the method to another. The Barabar Caves could represent a convergence: imperial resources, ascetic patronage, hard stone expertise, and the desire to create something permanent enough for Ashoka's age. There is also the theory of lost specialization. Not lost civilization, not lost supermachinery, but lost craft specialization. A particular workshop tradition may have existed during the Mauryan period, supported by royal demand. When that demand changed, the specialists may have dispersed, their techniques becoming less common or redirected toward other forms. Later, Indian rock-cut architecture became larger, more elaborate, and sculpturally rich, but the exact mirror-like granite finish of Barabar was not widely repeated. This does not mean later builders were less capable. It means they were solving different problems. They worked in different stones, for different patrons, with different religious and visual goals. The history of skill is not a ladder. It is a forest path with many branches, some of which become overgrown. The unfinished parts of Barabar are important here again. Lomas Rishi, with its incomplete interior and other less finished areas, remind us that the technique had limits. The builders were not using a magical process that made every surface perfect. They encountered problems. Rock flaws mattered. Work could stop. Plans could be interrupted. This helps us reject both extremes, the idea that the caves were crude and the idea that they were effortless. The truth is more demanding. The workers could achieve astonishing finish when conditions, resources, and time allowed. They could also be halted by the stone. Another question concerns manpower. How many workers were needed? We do not know. The chambers are not enormous, so they may not have required armies of labourers like some giant construction projects. But because granite is so difficult, the number of working hours could still have been high. At different stages, different teams may have been needed. Rough cutters at first, specialists for shaping, polishers for final surfaces, tool makers in support, supervisors and perhaps scribes or officials connected to the royal donation. The site may have had periods of intense activity and quieter stages. Work inside a cave also limits how many people can operate at once. Too many workers in a small enclosed space would create crowding, dust, and danger. The project was likely not only about the total number of people, but about sequencing them efficiently. We can also think about debris. Carving a room from granite produces a large quantity of broken stone, chips, grit, and dust. That material had to be carried out. The deeper the cave became, the more inconvenient removal became. Workers would need baskets, containers, or other carrying methods. The floor had to be kept clear enough to work. Dust could interfere with vision and breathing. If water was used in grinding or polishing, slurry would form and need cleaning. None of this sounds glamorous, which is precisely why it matters. Monumental construction is always partly about waste management. The finished chamber looks pure and calm because someone removed all the chaos that made it. Lighting is another practical difficulty. As the excavation moved inward, natural light became weaker. Lamps could be used, but lamps produce smoke, heat, and uneven illumination. Polishing requires seeing surface changes. A moving flame can help reveal flaws, but it also distorts. Workers may have used reflective light from the entrance, lamps placed at angles, or repeated checking at different times of day. The polished surface itself would gradually improve light inside the chamber by reflecting it. That is a lovely thought. The more the workers polished, the easier it may have become to see the results of polishing, as if the cave slowly began helping them finish it. The geometry of the rooms also invites debate. Some observers describe the interiors as extremely precise, almost machine-like. Others point out that while the finish is remarkable, the caves are not mathematically perfect in the modern industrial sense. Both observations can be true in their own way. The caves are highly controlled for ancient handmade granite interiors. They also show variations and imperfections when examined closely. The word perfect can mislead us if we use it carelessly. What matters is not flawless machine precision, but extraordinary human precision within a hard material and early architectural context. The caves do not need to be absolutely perfect to be astonishing. They only need to be as good as they are. This is where modern measurement can help, but also where it can narrow the experience. Laser scans, surface analysis, acoustic studies, and toolmark examination may reveal more about the caves in the future. These methods can measure curvature, smoothness, alignment, and resonance with far more detail than the naked eye. That is valuable. But measurement alone does not replace historical imagination. A scan can show the geometry. It cannot fully recreate the workshop, the decisions, the fatigue, the social world, or the religious purpose. We need both, technical analysis and humane interpretation. The caves are engineering and experience at the same time. Experimental archaeology could also help. Researchers and craftspeople might try to reproduce sections of polished granite using plausible ancient tools and abrasives. Such experiments would not prove exactly what happened, but they could show what is possible, how long processes might take, what tool wear looks like, and how surfaces develop. This kind of work is often humbling. Things that seem impossible on paper become possible with practice, and things that seem simple become hilariously difficult once attempted. It is one thing to say, polish the granite by abrasion. It is another to spend days rubbing stone and realize that the ancient worker you vaguely imagine now deserves a chair, a medal, and possibly a very long nap. There is also a quieter theory, less dramatic but persuasive. The builders may have learned by making. Perhaps the first surfaces were difficult, perhaps techniques improved during the project. Perhaps some caves reflect more complete mastery than others. We often imagine ancient projects as planned perfectly from the beginning, but real making involves adjustment. A team begins with known methods, encounters problems, solves them, improves, and carries the lesson forward. The caves may preserve not only a finished technology, but a learning process in stone. The purpose of the caves may also have influenced the techniques. If the spaces were meant for Ajivika ascetics, polish and shape were not random luxuries. They may have been part of a desired environment, clean, durable, resonant, severe, and separate from ordinary life. A rough cave might shelter the body, but a polished chamber changes the mind's relation to the space. The emperor's donation may have required a finish worthy of a royal support. The religious users may have valued the sensory effect. The builders may have been instructed to create a surface that reflected light and sound. We cannot prove each intention, but we can see that the technical choices and the spiritual atmosphere are connected. At the same time, we should allow for practical motives. Polished surfaces are easier to keep clean than rough ones. They reflect lamplight better. They may reduce dust shedding. They amplify sound. They look impressive. A single feature can serve many functions. Ancient builders did not have to choose between practical and symbolic, any more than we do. A church bell can tell time, call worshippers, mark events, and sound beautiful. A polished cave wall can reflect light, improve cleanliness, create prestige, enhance acoustics, and suggest controlled purity all at once. Good architecture often works in layers. The mystery of how they did it, therefore, does not come from total ignorance. It comes from partial knowledge. We know enough to reject the easiest fantasies. We know enough to outline plausible methods. We know enough to connect the caves to Mauryan stonework, Ashokan patronage, Ajivika use, granite excavation, and polishing traditions. but we do not know enough to watch the whole process step by step. We cannot name the chief mason. We cannot list the abrasives in order. We cannot say how many days it took to polish a wall. We cannot hear the discussions at the work site. The caves hold the answer in material form, but they do not translate it into words, and perhaps that is why they remain so compelling. If every detail were known, Barabar would still be important, but it might lose some of its quiet pull. The gap between visible achievement and missing process invites attention. It makes us look again. It prevents the past from becoming too tidy. The caves stand there, not as proof of impossibility, but as proof that ancient skill can exceed our expectations. They ask us to replace disbelief with curiosity. Not humans could not have done this, but what kind of humans, with what training, under what conditions, using what exact methods, made this possible? That question is much richer. It gives us workers instead of wonders without makers. It gives us workshops instead of miracles. It gives us empires, religions, tools, materials, and decisions. It lets us admire the Barabar Caves without turning them into nonsense. It lets mystery remain, but anchored to stone. So when someone stands before the polished granite and says the caves look too perfect to be ancient, there is a gentler answer waiting. They are not too perfect to be ancient. They are too skilled for the simple version of the past we sometimes carry around. They are not evidence that humans needed outside help. They are evidence that human knowledge can become very specialized, very refined, and very easy to lose when the society that supported it changes. The builders of Barabar did not leave us their names, but they left us their standard. And the standard is high enough that, more than 2,000 years later, we are still trying to meet it with our questions. From tools and theories, the story now begins to widen again. Because even if we could explain every chisel mark, every abrasive, every stage of polish, the caves would still not be exhausted. A technique can tell us how a chamber was made, but not everything about why it continues to matter. The Barabar Caves remain powerful because they sit at the meeting point of stone and silence, faith and empire, workmanship and absence. Their deepest message may not be hidden in a lost machine or secret tool, but in the way these dark, polished rooms still make us listen for people who are gone, and for a purpose that has not entirely returned from the echo. By the time we have followed the tools, the theories, the polishing, the echoes, and the strange calm of the chambers themselves, the Barabar Caves begin to feel less like a puzzle, waiting for a single answer, and more like a place that has been holding several truths at once. They are engineering achievements, certainly. They are religious spaces. They are royal gifts. They are early experiments in Indian rock-cut architecture. They are monuments to the vanished Ajivikas. They are examples of Mauryan stonework at an astonishing level of finish. They are dark rooms with voices that return from polished granite. And somehow, even after all of those labels have been placed carefully around them, they still do not feel completely explained. That is one of the reasons they stay with us. Some ancient sites become easier to understand the longer we look at them. Their purpose becomes clear. Their symbols line up. Their builders, patrons, users and rituals settle into a pattern that feels, if not complete, then at least manageable. Barabar does not quite do that. The facts are real, but they do not flatten the mystery. We know the caves belong to the Mauryan world. We know Ashoka and his successors are connected with their dedication. We know the Ajivikas used or received them. We know the granite was cut, shaped and polished with extraordinary care. We know the interiors produce powerful echoes. But between each known fact is a space of silence, and in Barabar, silence is never just empty. It has very good acoustics. To stand before these caves in the imagination is to stand before a question about what survives. The granite survives. The polish survives, not perfectly, not untouched, but enough to astonish. The inscriptions survive, giving us names, dates, and hints of purpose. The shape of the rooms survives. The echo survives, waiting patiently for each new visitor to test it with a word or a laugh or a careful chant. But the voices of the Ajivikas do not survive in the same way. Their books, if they had them in a lasting form, are gone. Their teachings are mostly known through the writings of others. Their daily practices in these caves are not recorded in the detail we would like. Their arguments, their routines, their hopes, their irritations, their small human habits, all of that has slipped away. History has kept the stone and lost many of the people. There is something quietly unfair about that. The people who use these chambers may have shaped their meaning far more than the emperor who gave them. They were the ones who entered during rains, sat in the dark, heard the echo, felt the polished wall under their hands, and allowed the cave to become part of a way of life. Yet they remain shadows. Ashoka's name has crossed centuries with great strength, carved into stone and carried through texts, memory, and modern history. The Ajivikas have not travelled so securely, and the workers, the people who actually cut and polish the granite, are even less visible. Their skill is everywhere, but their names are nowhere. Barabar is full of human presence and human absence at the same time. That combination may be the deepest whisper of the caves. They remind us that survival is not the same as fairness. The past does not preserve everything equally. It is selective, uneven, sometimes almost careless. A king's inscription may endure while a craftsman's entire life vanishes. A stone chamber may outlast the faith it was made for. A polished wall may remain when the songs or recitations once spoken inside it are gone. What reaches us is not the whole past, but fragments strong enough, lucky enough, or durable enough to cross the distance. Granite is good at this, breath is not. And yet the breath mattered. More than the stone perhaps to those who came there first. A cave is not fully alive until someone enters it. Without the person, it is a chamber. With the person, it becomes an experience. The air changes, the sound changes, the meaning changes. A polished granite room made for ascetics was not only a display of craft, it was a setting for human attention. Someone sat there, perhaps in the heat of the day when the stone stayed cool. Someone waited there while rain moved across the hills outside. Someone spoke in a low voice and heard the walls return it. Someone may have closed their eyes and found that the chamber was still present through sound, touch, and the weight of darkness. We cannot know exactly what those moments meant. That is important. It would be easy to invent a detailed ritual scene, complete with perfectly timed chanting, lamps arranged just so, and a solemn figure explaining the meaning of every echo in a way that would be very convenient for a documentary. But honest history resists that temptation. We do not have enough evidence to fill the chamber with certainty. What we can do is recognize the conditions the chamber created. It was dark, it was hard, it was polished, it was resonant, it was secluded, it was connected to a sect known for ascetic discipline, it was given under royal authority. From those facts, we can feel the shape of use, even if we cannot hear the exact words. The idea that the caves still whisper in the dark is not a claim that they literally speak. Granite is many things, but conversational is not usually one of them. The whisper is the kind left by places that continue to suggest more than they say. It is in the contrast between rough hill and smooth interior. It is in the way a cave meant for renunciants receives such refined workmanship. It is in the way a vanished faith left behind stone more durable than its own written voice. It is in the way the walls reflect sound, but not the meaning of the sounds once made there. The caves whisper because they offer evidence without explanation, presence without full memory, and calm without simplicity. They also whisper something about ancient ability. Barabar quietly corrects the lazy idea that the past was always crude until modern technology arrived to tidy everything up. The caves do not fit that story. They show patience, planning, and a level of stone finishing that still makes modern people pause. They ask us to take ancient craftspeople seriously, not as vague hands in the background of imperial history, but as experts in material, surface, and space. Whatever tools they used, they knew how to turn granite into an interior of remarkable control. Whatever methods they followed, they were good enough that the result still appears almost unnaturally smooth after more than 2,000 years. That does not mean we should swing to the opposite extreme and treat the caves as evidence of some impossible lost world beyond human explanation. That would be another way of refusing to see the workers. The wonder of Barabar lies in the difficult middle ground. The caves are human-made but not ordinary, explainable in principle, but not fully reconstructed in detail, ancient but not primitive, simple in appearance, but complicated in labour. They show us that human skill does not always leave a neat written record. Sometimes it leaves a surface, and what a surface it is. The mirror polish remains one of the most memorable features because it makes the stone behave against expectation. We expect ancient granite to be rough, or at least visibly carved. At Barabar, parts of the interior gleam. They do not reflect like modern glass, but they return light in a way that feels deliberate and almost intimate. A lamp, a flashlight, a moving body all can appear in the wall as softened shapes. This shine changes the emotional quality of the room. It makes the cave feel less like a hollow and more like a finished object. It also makes the darkness more noticeable. Light does not simply disappear, it slides, catches, and fades. The eye is reminded that someone worked very hard to make the stone respond. The echo does something similar for the ear. Sound enters the chamber and returns altered. A voice becomes a presence in the room. A chant may deepen. A footstep may repeat. Even silence after a sound can feel shaped by the memory of what just happened. The caves do not merely contain sound, they change its behaviour. This may be why they can seem, in a gentle sense, alive. Not alive like an animal or a tree, but active. They do something. They take a simple human action and send it back with the authority of polished granite. In a place connected to ascetic practice, that must have mattered, whether or not the builders planned every acoustic effect in advance. There is also a whisper about belief. The Ajivikas are difficult for us to recover, but their association with these caves gives them a rare physical presence. Their ideas about fate and cosmic order may feel distant now, especially in a world that prizes choice, personal control, and the ability to customize almost everything except the weather. But perhaps the caves can help us imagine their seriousness. A polished granite chamber is a severe place. It does not flatter human restlessness. It is stable, enclosed, and indifferent. It does not offer many distractions. For people who believed life moved according to an immense order beyond ordinary effort, such a space may have felt appropriate. The stone does not hurry. The echo returns according to its own rules. The darkness does not argue. The chamber simply is. That may be one reason Barabar still feels so different from ruins that are covered in imagery. Many ancient monuments tell us stories directly. Reliefs show kings, gods, battles, offerings, animals, rituals, and scenes of daily life. They give the eye content. Barabar gives the body conditions. It tells less and does more. It encloses. It reflects. It resonates. It cools. It darkens. It simplifies. Its meaning is not only carved into the wall, it is produced by standing inside. That kind of architecture is harder to explain in a single sentence because it is not just seen, it is experienced. And perhaps that is why the caves remain so good for quiet curiosity. They do not shout. They do not demand belief in wild theories. They do not need dramatic exaggeration. They only need us to notice the fact slowly. Granite hills in Bihar, Mauryan rulers, Ashokan inscriptions, a vanished ascetic sect, chambers cut from living rock, walls polished to a deep shine, echoes that make the human voice feel larger than itself, unfinished spaces that show the work was real and difficult, finished spaces that show how far that work could go. The mystery is already there, without adding anything unnecessary. When modern people ask whether these caves are too perfect to be human-made, perhaps the best answer is to gently turn the question around. What if the problem is not that the caves are too perfect for ancient humans, but that our idea of ancient humans is too small? What if we have become so used to machines that we forget what organised skill, time and devotion can accomplish? What if we mistake speed for intelligence and convenience for superiority? The builders of Barabar did not have electric grinders or diamond saws, but they had knowledge of stone, access to labour, imperial support, and a standard of finish that still commands respect. The caves ask us to admire without disbelief. They also ask us to accept limits. There may never be a complete answer to every technical question. We may learn more through archaeology, surface analysis, experimental reconstruction, and careful study. We may discover tool marks that clarify stages of work, abrasives that match surface patterns, or acoustic measurements that reveal more about the chamber's design. But some things may remain beyond recovery. The exact conversations at the work site, the moment a supervisor approved the polish, the first time an Ajivika chant filled the inner chamber, the private thoughts of someone sitting there during monsoon rain, those are not likely to return. The caves hold them only as absence. Absence can be meaningful. In a place like Barabar, what is missing is almost as important as what remains. The missing Ajivika voice makes the inscriptions more precious. The missing workshop record makes the polish more intriguing. The missing ritual detail makes the echo more haunting. The missing names of workers make the surfaces more human, not less, because every inch of finished stone becomes a substitute for a signature. We cannot name them, but we can recognise their work. Recognition is not everything, but after 2,300 years, it is something. And so the Barabar Caves sit quietly in the granite hills, neither fully explained nor truly silent. They belong to a world of empire and renunciation, of royal inscriptions and vanished doctrines, of hard labour and impossible-looking calm. They are not the largest ancient monuments. They are not the most decorated. They are not the most famous outside specialist circles, but they have a special power because they concentrate so many questions in such plain rooms. How did the builders polish granite so finely? Why were such refined chambers made for ascetics? What did the Ajivikas do inside them? How much of the echo was intended? Why did this particular kind of work not continue in the same way? How many skills have disappeared from history simply because nobody wrote them down? These questions do not need to be answered all at once. In fact, part of the pleasure of Barabar is letting them remain open for a while. The mind can sit with them the way a person might sit inside one of the chambers, listening to a sound fade slowly into stone. Not every mystery is a locked box waiting to be forced open. Some are more like caves. You enter, adjust to the darkness, notice the surfaces, hear your own thoughts return in a changed form, and leave with a sense that something has been understood but not entirely captured. That is a good place for a story like this to rest. We began with the idea of caves too perfect to be human-made, and we end with something better. Caves that are astonishing precisely because humans made them. Not with the ease of machines, not with full explanations left behind, not with every detail available to modern curiosity, but with hands, tools, organisation, patience, and a relationship with stone that we can still see but not fully reconstruct. The perfection is not a challenge to human history. It is part of human history, and perhaps one of the reasons history remains so humbling. So, as the night settles around this little journey, imagine the Barabar Hills once more. The outside air warm, the granite rounded and still, the entrance dark, a polished wall waiting inside, cool and smooth, a chamber that has heard languages change, kingdoms vanish, faiths rise and fade, visitors arrive and leave, and still it answers the smallest sound. Somewhere in that darkness the past is not speaking clearly, but it is not entirely silent either. It is whispering through polish, through echo, through the stubborn survival of stone. And here you are, a little farther along your own evening than when we began. having travelled without moving from your room to a set of ancient chambers in eastern India. If this quiet exploration brought you a little calm, a little curiosity, or a new respect for the forgotten hands that shaped the deep past, I would be ever so grateful if you liked the video, subscribed, and shared this sleepy corner of the earth with someone else who enjoys a mystery that does not need to shout. The Barabar Caves may keep many of their answers hidden in the dark, but perhaps that is why they remain so powerful. Some places do not give everything away. They wait, they echo, and they remind us that long after voices vanish, stone can still remember the shape of a whisper.